Li frowned for a moment before calmly saying, "Fellow Taoist Mei, since we arrived here together, it could be considered that there is some destiny between us. Since Lady Mei already mentioned it, I won't conceal it any longer. I feel that I am somewhat able to climb Stormwind Mountain. Regardless of whether it's the flying umbra beasts that circle the mountain or the hallucinogenic mist, I have methods of dealing with them. However, these methods will only work for me alone. I do not have the skill to bring along anyone else, as I would only be able to take care of myself when danger approaches. Fellow Taoist Mei would be certain to die. Since you are so young, it would be better to stay here. Perhaps there will be another opportunity to leave in the future." The final sentence was supposed to comfort her, but when Han Li heard himself say it, he couldn't help but feel that it sounded quite artificial. However, he had been speaking the truth. Mei Ning's face instantly paled, and she bit her lips in silence. When Han Li saw the woman turn silent, he sighed and closed his eyes once more. To tell the truth, he didn't have a bad impression of Mei Ning. Were she capable enough, he may have provided assistance, but as of right now, Han Li couldn't afford to increase the burden to himself. He could only still his heart and leave the woman behind. Fortunately, even if she was left behind in the Umbra realm, she wouldn't have too difficult a life. At worst, her path of immortal cultivation had come an end. He didn't have anything to feel guilty about. The room settled into silence. After an unknown amount of time passed, Han Li believed that the woman was crestfallen. When he was about to drift off to sleep, he suddenly heard her say, "If I can temporarily restore a bit of your magic power, would you be able to bring me out?" "What?" Han Li's eyes shot open and he stared at the woman with disbelief. His sleepiness had completely disappeared. Mei Ning had her hands wrapped around her knees as she sat on the bed. Her face turned to the side as if she hadn't spoken. Just as Han Li was doubting whether or not he had misheard, the woman stretched her body out and raised her head with determination clear in her eyes. "I have a method to temporarily restore a bit of magic power to Brother Han. Although it will last only a moment, it should be of great assistance when Han Li climbs the mountain. However, in addition to taking me away from this land, I have another condition for my assistance." After Mei Ning said this, her expression appeared strange, causing Han Li to feel slight doubt. Han Li stared at the woman and spoke with a heavy tone. "It's not that I don't believe you, but even a nascent soul cultivator was trapped here, incapable of restoring his abilities. Is fellow Taoist Mei joking?" At that moment, his expression was filled with doubt, but it also contained a trace of hope. If he could temporarily restore his magic power, his odds of escaping would be almost certain. Even if it was only a small bit of magic power for a short amount of time, it would be more than enough. His storage pouch had several threads that didn't need spiritual power to activate. With their wondrous powers, his safety would be further guaranteed. As for his spirit beast pouches, although the gold-devouring beetles and the blooded spider require spiritual sense to control, he would just barely be able to use the weeping soul pearl within his body to control the weeping soul beast. Although those umbra beasts weren't malicious spirits, they were condensed from umbra chi, something reminiscent of yin chi. They should at least be easily restrained, and wouldn't pose much of a threat to him. With that thought, Han Li grew excited. With a hesitant expression, Mei Ning whispered, "Although this little woman doesn't have mutated spiritual roots or heavenly spiritual roots, I possess the transient Jade Phoenix Marrow constitution. Brother Han should know what this means. Through a secret technique, I will be able to give Brother Han my transient spirit chi. The transient spirit chi is extremely pure spiritual power, and will be able to ward off the spirit extinguishing chi for a moment. Of course, the transient spiritual chi will eventually scatter, and fellow Taoist will once again be without any magic power. Transient Jade Phoenix Marrow constitution." Han Li was stunned for a moment, but soon after, he started to examine the woman with a strange gaze as his face revealed a trace of understanding. Mei Ning slowly said, "That's right. If fellow Taoist doubts me, he may examine me to know that my words aren't false." At the same time, a slight blush arose from her face. "You must excuse me." After a moment of hesitation, Han Li stood up and walked over. With something so important, he had no choice but to make certain. At that moment, Mei Ning forced herself to be calm as she rolled up her sleeve, revealing her arm. The arm actually had a spot of gecko cinnabar on it. Gecko cinnabar is supposed to tell whether or not someone is a virgin. As Han Li watched, the woman clenched her teeth and she lightly pressed her thumb onto the spot before quickly releasing it. Han Li's heart stirred as he watched from the bedside. He saw the spot of gecko cinnabar gradually fade away to reveal a silver phoenix pattern. The flowing brilliance made it appear astonishingly lifelike. Han Li muttered in delighted surprise, So this is the transient Jade spirit phoenix. Fellow Taoists should now know that I spoke truthfully. Mei Ning glanced at Han Li to confirm that he had seen it and hastily rolled down her sleeve with a flushed expression. Han Li nodded his head and silently returned to his seat as he started to think. Although she cannot be compared to those with extraordinary spiritual roots, she still possessed a rare constitution that was rarely seen even once every 100 years. Its presence was to be celebrated in the cultivation world, and everyone knew of its existence. Although only female cultivators could possess this constitution, and it didn't provide any assistance on the path of cultivation, they would be in great demand by many male cultivators. This was because once the woman entered late foundation establishment stage, her body would produce a strand of pure transient spirit qi. This transient spirit qi was known to be one of the 7 pure spiritual powers in the world. While it was of no use to a woman, it could easily cleanse a man's essence and allow their cultivation to greatly progress. Of course, while this essence cleansing effect was of lesser value to higher grade cultivators, it was still comparable to ancient rare medicinal pills. However, this transient spirit qi was something that could only be passed to man willingly. There was no way to forcefully extract it from her by using a secret technique. Furthermore, in her entire lifetime, she would only be able to give the transient spirit qi once. She won't be able to produce more of the spirit qi for the rest of her life. Additionally, if she lost her maidenhood before the transient spirit qi was transmitted, it would vanish. Han Li had previously browsed through records that were related to this matter. After recalling them, Han Li felt that if he acquired this spirit qi, it could be possible that he'd be able to use a bit of magic power. After all, transient spirit qi was one of the 7 pure spirit qi in the world. At the very least, it should allow him access to his storage and spirit beast pouches. With that thought, Han Li raised his head and swept his gaze to the beautiful woman, calmly asking, "Lady Mei, could you tell me your other condition?" After some hesitation, Mei Ning resolutely said, "It's simple. I wish for Brother Han to find my elder brother and bring him out of the Umbra realm." After some consideration, Han Li shook his head and said, "I'm afraid that I will only be able to meet that condition halfway." Halfway? Mei Ning wore a strange expression. It was clear she didn't understand what he meant by this. "Yes, there is another reason why I can't remain in the Umbra realm for too long. As such, I can only agree to do my utmost and spend 3 months searching for your brother. If I am not able to find him within that time, then I will have to set off immediately." After some thought and feeling that Han Li wouldn't budge on this matter, she nodded her head and agreed, 3 months. This place is that large. You should be able to find him in that time. All right, I accept." Han Li smiled at her frank acceptance. Mei Ning then stared at Han Li and slowly said, "Although I've only known you for a short while, I don't believe that I've misjudged you. As such, to prove to you that I intend to keep my word, I will give you the transient spirit qi whenever you ask. If Brother Han wishes for it now, then I will not hesitate to give it to you." Han Li was surprised that the woman had spoken so bluntly. However, his surprise only lasted for a moment before his expression quickly returned to normal. The Umbra realm is extremely dangerous, and surprises are almost certain to happen. It would be best that I immediately recover magic power so that I may take out a few treasures. Otherwise, we may be unprepared when danger comes knocking. Mei Ning heard Han Li. She nodded without the slightest surprise, but she soon thought of something and a slight blush appeared on her face. She whispered, "If I still had magic power, I would be able to easily give you the transient spirit qi with a mere touch of the hand. But under these circumstances, I am only able to transfer it to you through mouth-to-mouth contact." When Mei Ning said mouth-to-mouth contact, she lowered her head and her voice grew nearly indiscernible. Han Li was startled, but upon seeing her heart-wrenching bashfulness, his heartbeat quickened. In order to restore his magic power, he would have to kiss this beautiful woman. This was an alluring affair that Han Li wouldn't even have thought of, arousing a strange sensation in his heart. The air in the room became obscurely warm. Seeing Mei Ning silently lower her head, Han Li knew that she wouldn't take the initiative despite having little experience in this regard. After all, they didn't have a particularly intimate relationship. With that thought, Han Li wordlessly stood up and arrived at the stone bed's side with a blur, sitting closely at the woman's side. Mei Ning unconsciously pulled back, but Han Li's arm was wrapped around her waist, holding her in place. The woman's heart began a heavily thump as she raised her head. When she saw Han Li's mysterious smile, she bowed her head again with a blush. However, Han Li raised her head with his free hand and prevented her from turning away. Mei Ning felt her mind grew completely blank as her heart fluttered. Han Li took a deep breath and smelled her faint fragrance. Then when he saw the bashful charm that exuded from her eyes, his heart grew fervent and he could no longer restrain himself. He lowered his head and fiercely pressed his lips onto hers. It was warm, fragrant, and even a little sweet, arousing a feeling of ecstasy. As this occurred, Mei Ning's eyes grew weak and despondent. But a short moment later, she regained her bearings and she weakly attempted to push Han Li away. Although she had already made preparations for Han Li's advance, she became overwhelmed with shyness as she faced the real thing and became completely flustered. Although this woman had many suitors, she had never been intimate with any of them. The kiss sent waves of ecstasy throughout Han Li, leaving him filled with desire. When she pushed her hands against Han Li, he boorishly pressed against her soft body. Taking advantage of the fact they were on the bed, he greedily grasped her lips with his own as if they were ambrosia. Given Mei Ning's inferior strength, she had lost hope of breaking free once she entered his embrace. Although she had weakly struggled for a moment, she had eventually given up all resistance and closed her eyes, taking in the dense masculine scent that surrounded her. Her cheeks were flushed red as her long eyelashes fluttered, and her mind grew confused and lost. For a time, the woman had completely forgotten to bestow the transient spirit Qi. However, due to Han Li's exceedingly staunch will, he was able to regain clarity from his crazed passion after a short moment. Han Li parted lips with Mei Ning for the time being and brought his mouth to her fine, small ears. He chuckled and said, "Lady Mei, although the feeling of a man and a woman being together is truly wonderful, don't forget to bestow the transient spirit Qi to me." When she heard this, her body trembled and her face grew to an even deeper shade of scarlet. Han Li's boorish behavior from before had now disappeared. He gently pressed his lips against her small mouth and began to feel a cold sensation slowly enter his body from their lips. Han Li didn't dare to be negligent and hastily climbed off Mei Ning and sat down cross-legged to the side as he began to circulate the spiritual qi throughout his body. Soon after, Mei Ning sat upright on the bed and flusteredly straightened out her disheveled robes with a scarlet face. For a time, she was incapable to regaining her bearings. The woman hesitantly stole a quick peek at Han Li and saw that his eyes were closed, causing her to unconsciously sigh in relief. She then stood up from the bed and walked over to the chair that Han Li originally sat in. A complicated expression appeared on her face as she began to stare at Han Li's tranquil expression. After an unknown amount of time, Han Li eventually opened his eyes and saw the worried expression in Mei Ning's eyes. In that instant, she hastily turned her face away, not daring to meet his gaze. Han Li smiled upon seeing that the woman was at a loss. However, his smile immediately disappeared as he slapped his storage pouch. Items began to continuously emerge with flashes of white light appearing at Han Li's side. Not longer after, a large pile had formed. There were materials such as demon beast hides among these items. It was unknown what Han Li intended to use them for. You can use magic power. Although Mei Ning held confidence in her transient spirit qi, she had shouted in joy upon seeing that Han Li was truly able to use his storage pouch. Han Li smiled and said, "I don't possess enough magic power to even cast low-grade magic techniques, but opening a storage pouch shouldn't be a problem." After making sure that he had everything he needed, he put away the ancient treasures such as the golden mirrors, the flower basket, and the silver bell into the storage pouch with a wave of his sleeve. When Mei Ning saw this, she was overwhelmed for a moment. An odd expression appeared on her face when she glanced at the pile of items at Han Li's side. Feeling that something was amiss, she hesitantly asked, "Brother Han, I haven't asked you this yet. Are you a Foundation establishment cultivator?" Han Li had no intention of concealing anything and openly replied, "Of course not. I'm a core formation cultivator." What? Although Mei Ning had suspected this, she couldn't but cry out in surprise. Han Li chuckled and paid no further heed to the woman's sudden change in expression. He slapped the spirit beast pouch at his side, summoning a small monkey in a flash of brilliance. Surprisingly, the weeping soul beast was extremely excited once it appeared. It sniffed around Han Li several times before frequently hopping around him. Han Li's heart stirred at the sight. Having yet to recognize this famed beast, Mei Ning merely glanced at the monkey with a curious expression. "Lady Mei, stay here for a moment. I wish to take advantage of my remaining magic power and attend to a few matters," Han Li calmly said. "A few matters," the woman blinked in slight confusion. Without saying anything further, Han Li began to store various items amongst his robes and departed from the room without paying any heed to the items he left behind. Upon leaving the room, Han Li glanced around. The sky appeared the same as always since there was differentiation of day or night, but regardless, there was far less movement in the village. It was likely that a majority of people had fallen asleep. And Li beckoned to the weeping soul beast and had it enter his sleeve with a quick scamper. He then smiled at Mei Ning before confidently walking off. As for Mei Ning, she merely remained in the room with blank confusion on her face. Han Li walked through the village with extremely nimble movements, avoiding the gaze of others. In an instant, he stopped in front of one of the larger buildings in the village. After taking a quick glance around, he pushed open the door without any hesitation and walked inside. Han Li's expression then revealed joy. As expected, this was one of the buildings that stored dark water. Han Li took out several large-capacity void containers that he early grabbed from his storage pouch and filled up about half of the building's reserves before leaving. Then after turning a few corners, he spotted a rather unusually fashioned stone building. His expression stirred and he stopped in place. If hadn't guessed incorrectly, this should be the residence of the middle-aged man surnamed Feng. At that moment, he felt his meager magic power begin to fade away. Han Li swept his gaze over his surroundings. Ensuring that no one was nearby, he slapped his spirit beast pouch and had a single black-tainted gold-devouring beetle silently fly out. Then, with great difficulty, he managed to command it with a sliver of spiritual sense. The insect then shot toward the stone room with a buzz and slipped in through a small crack. The building was extremely quiet. Han Li inwardly sneered and walked back to his residence without looking behind him. By the time he had turned a corner, he heard a miserable wail from the middle-aged man's residence. Han Li pursed his lips and expressionlessly continued on his way. However, the disturbance had already begun to attract the attention of the villagers. Since the middle-aged man was all but guaranteed to come for revenge, it would be better to cleanly deal with him while Han Li still had use of his magic power and spiritual sense. Otherwise, the man would remain a worry on his mind. The remaining magic power that had been produced by the transient spirit Qi had disappeared by the time he returned to his residence. Likewise, his spiritual sense was once again incapable of leaving his body. Han Li could only shake his head in helplessness as he hurried back. After walking into the room, he found Mei Ning lying down on the bed. From the rhythm of her soft breaths, it seemed she had fallen asleep a while ago. When Han Li saw her sleeping figure, he recalled the kiss from not long before and felt his heart roil. But after seeing the woman's figure coldly curled up on the bed, he hesitated for a moment before fetching a large piece of demon beast hide from the pile of materials on the table and placing it on top of the woman. She soon relaxed her expression, and she unconsciously rolled the beast hide around her, remaining soundly asleep. Han Li couldn't help but chuckle at the sight. This turn of events was of no surprise. Although she possessed a body that was far superior to ordinary mortals, she was still a member of the fairer sex, and both her mind and body must have been exhausted from all that happened. As a result, she had unintentionally fallen asleep. Han Li smiled, and then turned his attention to the pile of materials on the desk, with a strange expression appearing in his eyes. Not long after, Mei Ning slowly roused from her slumber. Before her eyes were entirely open, she heard a calm voice speak. "If fellow Taoist Mei is awake, then please get up. We will be busy with preparations over the next 2 days." After she heard Han Li's words, her face reddened and she sat up. Naturally, the demon beast hide fell off as a result. This surprised her, and she glanced in the direction of Han Li's voice with a complicated expression. Han Li was currently sitting in a chair and was handling a rather large piece of demon beast hide. After Mei Ning rose, he smiled at her. "Would fellow Taoist Mei happen to be skilled in needlework? I have a few high-grade fire attribute demon beast hides. If it is possible, it would be best to turn them into clothes so that we'd be able to better resist yin winds." Mei Ning's embarrassment waned after seeing that Han Li hadn't brought up the matter of yesterday's kiss. But for some unknown reason, she also felt a trace of indescribable disappointment. Still, her face slightly blushed as she replied, "I can give it a try, but I'll be requiring a needle and thread." Han Li grabbed a faint blue needle on the table and handed it over to her. "This demon beast hide is rather tough. Only flying needle magic tools are able to pierce through them. You'll also be using the beast's tendons to sew the hide together. In the end, we will only use this to withstand the yin wind, so there is no point in caring about appearance." The needle was a top-grade magic treasure that was extremely sharp. Han Li had acquired it from some unfortunate cultivator that he had already forgotten about. He felt that it would prove quite useful as of present and took it out of his storage pouch. Mei Ning bit on her lips and softly whispered, "I will do my best." Han Li nodded and thought to say something else when he heard footsteps from outside. An old man's voice soon followed. "Is fellow Taoist present?" "Who is it?" Han Li asked, confused. He felt that the voice was rather familiar and soon recalled that it belonged to the long-haired old man. "He, fellow Taoist, and I had quite an enjoyable chat yesterday on top of the stone platform." Since it was the cultivator from the day before, Han Li found it awkward to keep the door shut. And since he was also curious about why they had suddenly paid him a visit, he walked towards the door and opened it, revealing the chuckling long-haired old man and two other old men behind him. One was red-faced and white-haired, while the other had a hunchback and an eerie aura. "Please come in." Han Li confidently invited the three in without asking them of their intentions. "So this is fellow Taoist Mei." When the three saw Mei Ning, they revealed a slight trace of astonishment before calmly saluting her. Mei Ning returned the greeting and moved to stand by Han Li's side. She remained silent, as if she were deferring the matter to Han Li. The three pensively glanced at one another. After they took a seat, Han Li glanced at the other two and slowly asked, "Are these two also?" Fellow Taoist guessed correctly. "These two are fellow cultivators who arrived from the great state of Jin. This is fellow Taoist Yun from the Heavenly Talisman Sect, and this is fellow Taoist Jin from the Four Seas Institute." Han Li nodded his head to each of them. The two then examined Han Li before politely smiling at him. Han Li calmly asked, "May I ask what brings you three here?" The three old men unconsciously glanced at each other. After a short moment, the long-haired old man dryly coughed and spoke with a deep tone. "Fellow Taoist Han might not know this, but Elder Feng, the village's instructor for martial arts, suddenly died after being devoured alive by a nameless, exotic insect. It is said that the exotic insect bit his neck in his sleep, and he died a miserable death as a result." With a completely unchanged expression, Han Li indifferently said, "Oh, so it was like that. What kind of exotic insect could possibly be so fearsome?" The three then began to mutter among themselves, as they were unable to tell whether or not Han Li was related to the event. The long-haired old man stared at Han Li as he slowly said, "This isn't entirely clear. By the time he screamed, he was already on the verge of death. When the other villagers saw a flying insect fly from his wound, they immediately struck it with their weapons, but as the insect was incredibly hard, they weren't able to wound it in the least. As the insect was covered in blood, it was difficult to make out the exact details of its appearance." The other two solemnly stared at Han Li in silence. With an unchanged expression, Han Li leaned back in his chair and lazily said, "What? Could it be you three believe that I killed him? Are you three here to punish me?" The old man's expression slightly changed as he chuckled. "How could that be possible? We absolutely don't believe that fellow Taoist Han could have done such a thing. Even if he did it, we would be incredibly happy. That mortal named Feng had always viewed us with disdain just because of his martial arts. It is better that he is dead." Han Li narrowed his eyes and stared at the three in silence. The long-haired old man's eyes shifted and he probingly said, "However, I heard that Elder Feng paid a visit to fellow Taoist's room yesterday. Soon after, he left in a crestfallen manner. Additionally, they found that his arm was broken at the time of death. It seems even without any magic power, fellow Taoist Han still possessed some powerful techniques." Upon hearing their words, Han Li raised his eyebrows. It seemed these three held some influence in the village. They were actually able to find out that the man surnamed Feng had entered his room yesterday and that he was driven off. After a moment of silence, Han Li's voice grew cold. "Could you three fellow Taoists be here for that matter? If that's the case, please be direct. I have no interest in beating around the bush." This. The old men couldn't help but glance at each other with hesitant expressions upon seeing Han Li be so direct. Unwilling to speak in circles, Han Li's expression grew impatient. "Since you are unwilling to speak, then I won't force you. How about you come back some other time?" Spurred by Han Li's words, the hunchbacked old man said, "Fellow Taoist Han, would you be interested in governing the village with us?" "What do you mean?" Han Li frowned, already guessing what he truly meant. Seeing that his companion had already struck the main point of the matter, the long-haired old man revealed everything. "Since we are fellow cultivators, I will speak bluntly. Surely fellow Taoists saw that apart from the head elder, all of the others are mortals. They hold greater power in the village because they were here before us. Cultivators are held to the same standard as mortals and eat and starve as they do. The mortals even have us risk our lives to hunt umbra beasts. Contrarily, we are the only ones that are capable of using spells with the umbra beast gems, yet they all hold the gems in their hands. It is utterly humiliating to be treated as criminals without cause. Since this is the case, us cultivators have joined hands to grasp authority in the village. Would fellow Taoist Han care to join us? After hearing their offer to take control of the village, Han Li indifferently asked, "So you wish to seize power?" The red-faced old man spoke with a strange emotion flickering within his eyes. "That's right. How can cultivators like us serve at the beck and call of those so-called elders? We should be the elders of the village, not those mortals. I'm a Grand Foundation establishment cultivator. It is unbearable to have been controlled by mortals for this long. Because we had too few cultivators, we didn't dare to take action, but with the addition of you two, success will be very likely." Han Li swept his gaze over the three and expressionlessly said, "I'm not interested. Please return. I'll pretend that this discussion never took place." Han Li's response had greatly shocked them. The long-haired old man then forced a smile and further attempted to persuade him. "Does fellow Taoist truly wish to become an inhabitant of this village? So long as we seize the positions of elders in the village, the power will be divided amongst us few. As a result, even if the conditions are poor, we can act freely." Han Li stroked his chin and serenely said, "I think that you fellow Taoists are misunderstanding something. The two of us never said we intended on staying in this village. We will be leaving in 2 days. As such, your words are based on nothing more than a fantasy. Lady May and I will have nothing to do with the matter." After a moment of shock, the long-haired old man couldn't help but say, "Leaving? Are you two searching for another village since you are unsatisfied with this one? You two might not know this, but our village is among the best villages in the area. The other villages' conditions are far worse than ours." And Li smiled and lightly shook his head in silence. The hunchbacked old man wore a look of astonishment when he came to a realization. "Could it be that you two intend on climbing Stormwind Mountain?" Han Li smiled and said, "What's wrong? Since we are unwilling to remain here, is there anything strange about wanting to leave?" With an odd expression on his face, the red-faced old man twirled his beard and said, "This isn't something that is merely strange. Don't you two realize that Stormwind Mountain is extremely dangerous?" Han Li looked at him and flatly said, "Although I don't know much about it, I've gained an approximate understanding from the chief elder." The hunchbacked old man's face contorted several times before he fearlessly said, "Humph, what does he know of the Stormwind Mountain's fearsomeness? He probably only knows from hearsay, but fellow Taoist Yun and I have personally experienced the true terror of Stormwind Mountain. It isn't something that cultivators can face without magic power. The tremendously powerful Umbra beasts that surround the mountain are an instant death sentence if you alarm them. Even if you manage to luckily slip past them, the violent yin winds and the illusory mist are incredibly deadly. There wouldn't be the slightest chance of climbing to the top of the mountain. Furthermore, being able to leave the Umbra realm during an appearance of a crevice in space is only a rumor, as no one has truly tested it. Perhaps it isn't even possible to begin with." Han Li's expression stirred and he asked with great interest, "You two fellow Taoists have already climbed Stormwind Mountain. Could you tell us about it?" The red-faced cultivator revealed trepidation as he slowly said, "Of course, fellow Taoist Han. We also wish to talk of it in the hopes that fellow Taoist will abandon his hope of succeeding by a fluke. Originally, fellow Taoist Jin and I were unwilling to spend the rest of our lives here when we had just arrived at the Umbra realm. After spending a year in preparation, we set off to Stormwind Mountain together along with 3 other fellow Taoists. Before we even arrived at the peak, one of our members was discovered by an Umbra beast and was devoured. The rest of us painstakingly pushed forward, but 2 of our ranks were frozen from the yin winds a quarter way up the mountain. As fellow Taoist Jin and I carried a few ember stones on our body, we were able to persevere. But as we climbed higher, the yin winds became increasingly more powerful, and we were incapable of keeping steady footing. In the end, we only made it halfway up the mountain before we were blown off a cliff by the gales. We hadn't even reached the illusory mists. Surviving by sheer luck, we lost all will to continue onward and could only return helplessly. And after we managed to return to the village, we were bedridden for several months due to having the yin winds penetrate deeply into our bones. Once we eventually recovered, we completely abandoned any thoughts of climbing Stormwind Mountain." Han Li rubbed his chin and pensively muttered, "That is quite fearsome." The old man spoke in a sincere tone. It was far more fearsome than could be described. "Please perish the thought and abandon the attempt. Although it may seem possible, the mountain will take your life. Besides, you are still young. Once we reach our end, all the authority in the village will fall into your hands. Fellow Taoists, please don't try to change my mind. I will only abandon my hopes after personally failing in the attempt. Naturally, if I am truly incapable of reaching Stormwind Mountain's peak, then I will give deep consideration towards your proposal. The three were somewhat displeased at his response and further attempted to persuade him. However, Han Li remained completely determined. Helpless, the three turned their gazes to Mei Ning, but she only said, "I will follow Brother Han's decision regardless." Their gazes turned blank at her response. Fortunately, Han Li hadn't refused them. If he managed to survive his attempt to climb the mountain, they would have another opportunity to recruit him. Since they were unable to persuade them, they could only force a smile before taking their leave. After they reached a distance away, the hunchbacked old man solemnly asked, "Do you think they will betray us?" The long-haired old man shook his head. "Betray us? What do they have to gain from betraying us? Surely you saw that the youngster surnamed Han is an intelligent person. He wouldn't do something so foolish, and the woman is following his lead as well. We can only hope that the two will realize the truth once they draw close to Stormwind Mountain and will turn back. After all, our revolt only has a 50-50 chance of success. With the other two, our strength would be considerably increased." Fortunately, youngster Han unwittingly eliminated the greatest obstacle, Feng Tianji. His martial arts would have posed a difficult problem otherwise. The red-faced old man nodded his head. "That's right. This person is truly cautious and wouldn't do something so strenuous and unrewarding. But just in case, we should send people to monitor them to avoid any potential mishaps. Brother Yin is quite thorough. Please have it done. However, we must be careful and avoid having him discover them. Regardless." A doubtful expression appeared on the long-haired old man's face. The hunchbacked old man was confused and asked, "Regardless?" The long-haired old man muttered, "It might be an error on my part, but I felt that youngster Han seemed completely confident that he could depart from the Umbra realm. He was completely unfazed when we mentioned the dangers of Stormwind Mountain. Could it be that he truly has a way to climb to the peak of Stormwind Mountain?" The hunchbacked old man shook his head and dubiously said, "How is that possible? The Yin winds are unsurmountable. Brother Yun, I, and the countless frozen corpses around the mountain can attest to this. It is only a vain thought to believe one could actually escape this place. Yes, it must have been a trick of the eyes." After some thought, the long-haired old man concluded that it was truly impossible and smiled in self-mockery. But when the red-faced old man heard this, his heart suddenly stirred and a thought came to mind. When the three old men departed, Han Li spoke a few words to Mei Ning and left the room. He went over to the residence of the middle-aged man surnamed Feng and saw that he did truly die from having his throat torn open by the gold-devouring beetle. After taking a look at his corpse from a distance, Han Li left and began to continue his inquiries with the villagers about the circumstances of the land, the whereabouts of other villages, and the distribution of the Umbra beasts. Eventually, all of these small details were gathered together in his mind as information vital to escaping this land, and he was able to draw a detailed map from the villagers' descriptions. In the following 2 days, Han Li finished most of his preparations and went to inform the village chief elder that they intended on climbing Stormwind Mountain. The plump old man naturally felt that this was a pity and urged Han Li to stay, but after seeing Han Li's unwavering resolve, he didn't push the issue. After Han Li returned to the residence, he and Mei Ning slept through the night. But in the early hours of morning on the next day, someone stealthily paid them a visit and knocked on their door. When Han Li saw the red-faced old man, he was shocked. "Fellow Taoist Yun." "Fellow Taoist Han, I will keep matters short. Although I don't know whether or not you truly have the ability to leave this land, you could be considered my last hope. If you truly are capable of slipping past the disasters of Stormwind Mountain, I hope that you can deliver this box to my heavenly talisman sect." With a serious expression, he took out a rough case made of bone and handed it over to Han Li with both hands. Han Li glanced at the case made of bone but didn't move to receive it. With an indifferent expression, he asked, "What do you mean?" He wasn't about to take the case before realizing what it was. The red-faced old man let out a long sigh and said, "There is no need for fellow Taoists to think much of it. The case contains the refinement method for one of our sect protecting talismans, the spirit subjugation talisman. Originally, only the sect master could learn it. I only have one intention. I wish for fellow Taoist Han to deliver the talisman refinement method on my behalf. I don't wish for the talisman to forever be lost from the sect." Soon after, he lifted the cover of the case to reveal several pieces of engraved bone. A trace of hesitation appeared on Han Li's face. "The spirit subjugation talisman. Since only the sect master could learn, then your esteemed self must be the heavenly talisman sect master." The old man conceded, I shamefully admit that I am the 57th sect master of the Heavenly Talisman sect, a small dying sect from the state of Jin's Flower Cloud province. It is quite laughable that a Foundation establishment cultivator like myself acted in the position of sect master. Strange expression momentarily appeared on Han Li's face, but he soon frowned. After a short moment, he glanced at the old man and slowly said, "The spirit subjugation talisman should certainly be unique considering that only the sect master could learn it. Fellow Taoist Yun doesn't fear that I would learn of its contents. Additionally, while I have heard of the resounding name of your country, I've never been there before, and I'm unsure of whether or not an opportunity would truly arise for me to visit. From how I see it, aren't you being a bit too rash?" When the red-faced old man heard Han Li's questions, he didn't reveal the slightest surprise. Instead, he replied with an appreciative expression, "Since I am giving this item to you, I've already accepted that fellow Taoist Han will learn the talisman refinement technique as payment. To tell the truth, I'm not sure whether you would be interested in learning it after taking a look at it." Although the refinement method of the spirit subjugation talisman has been passed down from generation to generation, it had only been refined a scarce few times by the founders. It has merely continued to be passed down despite not being refined by the later sect masters. And since my own sect was already greatly weakened, this talisman will only serve as a sentimental dream of mine. As for whether or not Brother Han can arrive in the country of Jin, it doesn't really matter. I merely find peace of mind that the sect founder's creation isn't forever lost from the cultivation world. Even if the talisman refinement method truly isn't capable of returning to the sect, it will be good enough if fellow Taoist Han passes it down so that it doesn't remain lost. When I later face the previous generations of sect masters in the underworld, I will have an excuse. The red-faced old man spoke with a bitter smile. When Han Li heard this, he was somewhat dumbfounded. The Heavenly Talisman sect master was only seeking peace of mind. It seemed that the exchange was incredibly one-sided in Han Li's favor, and that he wouldn't suffer any loss. If he truly was incapable of going to the great state of Jin, then he had no obligation to return the bone case. But if he was able to visit this famed country, then delivering the item would only take a minor effort. Furthermore, it seemed that the spirit subjugation talisman was a rather miraculous talisman for it to be so difficult to refine. It greatly piqued Han Li's interest. According to his vast experiences, apart from the commonly refined talismans of the 5 elements, there were talismans with unfathomable and extraordinary effects known as secret talismans. These secret talismans weren't difficult to differentiate among the 5 elements. Additionally, each sect had their own unique method of refining their own secret talisman, making it extremely difficult for outsiders to copy them. For example, when the Star Palace elders had nearly killed him in a sneak attack from Heaven Void Hall, they had used a proxy produced by the Incarnation Talisman. Afterwards, they used a transportation talisman unique to the Star Palace to escape. Of course, the Incarnation Talisman was worth far more than the Teleportation Talisman despite both being secret talismans. After some further thought, Han Li accepted the bone case without any further hesitation and solemnly pledged, "I can only promise that I will try my best. Fellow Taoist Yun shouldn't expect too much." That's fine. I'm already completely grateful for Brother Han's words." The red-faced old man appreciatively thanked him several times. Afterwards, he had a quick chat with Han Li before tactfully taking his leave. Han Li stood by the building's entrance as he watched the old man walk away before weighing the bone case in his hand. It was light. There didn't seem to be anything profound about the bone case itself. Mei Ning, who had been silently standing behind him, couldn't help but ask, "This is the first time I've heard of this spirit subjugation talisman. Could it truly be powerful?" Han Li smiled at Mei Ning and said, "I don't know, but I reckon it is unordinary at the very least." Soon after, he sat down beside the table in the room and started to look through each of the bones. After a mere glance, Han Li yelped in shock. "What? Is there a problem with the talisman refinement method?" Mei Ning sat down across from Han Li and glanced at him with bright curiosity. Ever since their kiss, they'd become somewhat more familiar with one another, and their original awkwardness had disappeared. "It's nothing. It's just that the materials required to refine the spirit subjugating talisman are truly extraordinary. It was no wonder that the Heavenly Talisman sect didn't dare to refine this talisman." After looking through all of the bones, he casually closed the bone case aside. Mei Ning curiously asked, "What are these materials that Brother Han finds so extraordinary?" Han Li grabbed a bone shard and smiled, saying, "Its primary materials can't be considered much, But there is one extraordinary material that can't be bought with spirit stones, the soul of a metamorphosis stage demon beast. Wouldn't you say that is extraordinary? The soul of a demon beast at metamorphosis stage. Mei Ning gasped in astonishment. However, Han Li's mysterious expression, as he grasped the bone shard, had completely escaped her notice. Having rested for the night, Han Li and Mei Ning left the village without notifying anybody else, much to the astonishment of the village guards. Han Li found himself standing on yet another pile of rocks as he gazed into the yellow desert in front of him. After getting their bearings, Han Li and Mei Ning headed towards the nearest village. Han Li's plans were quite simple: find the elder brother of Mei Ning. If he was alive, he was certain to be found in another village, and when he was found, Han Li would bring him and Mei Ning to Stormwind Mountain. Mei Ning felt that this plan was reasonable and followed his lead without complaint. Then in the blink of an eye, the two faded away into the endless sand. In expanse of blood-crimson soil, there were a dozen young gray-robed men and women with bone pikes stealthily climbing up a tall mound and slowly surrounding it. At the top of the mound, there were many green beasts with short and thick necks who were currently curled up in their sleep. These were umbra beasts by the name of Jade yin toads. Their bodies were small and covered in lumps. While they appeared as if they were just enlarged toads from the mortal world, they didn't possess an ounce of poison on their bodies and were one of the few umbra beasts that were edible to humans. These people had naturally come to hunt the Jade yin toads to ease the crisis of their village's food shortage. The group's actions were nimble and silent. By the time they had completely surrounded them, a Jade yin toad suddenly opened its red eyes and saw that there were humans about 100 meters away. Attack! As soon as that was shouted, the beast began to croak in warning, but in the blink of an eye, over a dozen sparkling white bone pikes were shot towards the beasts. As a result, a majority of the Jade yin toads had leapt away, and only 2 had met the barrage of spears. However, these 2 were the most vigorous of the toads, and they managed to dodge out of the way, ending up with only scrapes from the spears. The Jade yin toads were among the weakest of umbra beasts. Apart from being able to spout a few mouthfuls of yin qi, they had few other powerful attacks. However, they were particularly adept at using their powerful jumps to escape with astonishing effectiveness. The remaining 2 Jade yin toads took large breaths and spouted out large clouds of black yin qi. Afterwards, they jumped 25 meters into the air and broke the encirclement. Although the group had continued to use their pikes without reserve, they were clearly too slow and were incapable of catching up to the 2 Jade yin toads. After the 2 Jade yin toads leapt towards a strange expanse of stone in the distance, a flash of azure light sparked, resulting in the 2 toads falling to the ground with their throats gouged. Green blood painted the red ground. This scene caused the dismayed youths to look on with astonishment. With gusts of winds, 2 azure streaks flew out from the umbra beast corpses towards a nearby boulder. Afterwards, a man and a woman clothed in blue beast leather appeared on top of the boulder with a blur. The man's appearance was ordinary in contrast to the woman's heart-swaying beauty, but a vast intelligence shined within his eyes. These 2 individuals were Han Li and Mei Ning. Han Li held 2-inch-long daggers in each of his hands. There was semi-transparent string wrapped around both of their hilts, which appeared to be made from a slim beast tendon. Han Li walked over and glanced down at the umbra beast carcasses before turning his gaze to the vigilant crowd. He smiled and amiably said, "I hope you won't take offense. I saw that 2 Jade yin toads were about to escape and I couldn't help but take action. But regardless, I have no desire towards these Jade yin toads. I merely wish to ask you a few questions." One of the older party members doubtfully asked, "You truly do not want the beast carcasses?" It seemed he was the leader of the group of youths. Han Li nudged a beast carcass with his foot and affirmatively replied, "Of course I don't. I already have plenty of food." Although the man felt this was somewhat strange, he felt that there was nothing to lose and he eventually nodded his head. "All right, go ahead and ask." Han Li nodded, satisfied to see his tactful response, and calmly asked, "Are you natives to this land?" The man frowned and replied, "That's right, we are villagers of Red Soil Village." "That's good. We arrived here to make some inquiries. Have there been any new arrivals that have joined your village? We are searching for someone." After a moment of thought, he hesitantly said, "New arrivals? None. However, after the appearance of the last spatial tier, we spotted several remains of both men and women in the Umbra Beast lair. By the time we spotted them, Umbra Beasts had already cleanly devoured them until nothing but bones were left." Standing behind Han Li, Mei Ning grimaced and said, "Bones." In the past month, the two had already visited 3 villages. Although there were a couple of cultivators that had narrowly survived the spatial tier, there was no sign of her brother. Seeing that Han Li only wished to find someone, he relaxed and openly said, "That's right. We've already buried their remains, but we have their possessions. They were placed in a village warehouse. Would you like to take a look?" Han Li glanced at the silent Mei Ning before nodding. "That'd be good. We'll have to trouble you." If her brother's possessions happened to be among them, then the search would be over. He had to confirm them just in case. After calling out to those behind him to deal with the caresses of the toads, he cordially chatted with Han Li. "He. From your tone, it seems you're quite cultured. I could tell you're an outsider. Have you just arrived in this land?" Han Li beamingly smiled in response. The two then followed the group for a couple of kilometers before arriving at an unfamiliar village. This village was far smaller than the others. Although they also had stone walls surrounding them, they were only about 20 meters tall and appeared worn out as if from long neglect. From the size of the village, it seemed there were only about 100 inhabitants at most. After entering the village, their leader pointed at a relatively large stone room and apologetically told the 2 cultivators to head to the building by themselves. As the toad carcasses were vitally important, the villagers had to deal with them first. Han Li didn't mind this and spoke a few words of thanks before heading there with Mei Ning. Han Li glanced at the torn, bloody robes and asked with slight surprise, "These truly belong to your brother?" Han Li truly didn't expect that as soon as they entered that Mei Ning would immediately spot her brother's remnants. Her face had immediately grown pale at the sight, and her eyes had become completely dispirited. Mei Ning stared at the remnants with red eyes and muttered, "How could I possibly mistake these clothes? I personally made them for him. The storage pouch also has our sect's insignia." Not knowing what to say to console her, Han Li could only hesitate for a moment before patting the woman's shoulders and quietly slipping away from the stone room. He knew that it would be better for her to be alone for the time being. Just after he left, he began to hear faint sobs from the room. Han Li let out a sigh and then looked to the sky in silence. A while later, Mei Ning left the room with swollen eyes. She calmly said, "Let's go. Since my brother has passed, there is no longer any need to visit the other villages. Let's head straight to Stormwind Mountain." It seemed she had stifled the pain from the loss of her brother. Han Li calmly replied, "Before we head off to Stormwind Mountain, there is still something I must do. I need to acquire a few Umbra Beast Gems." Mei Ning was stunned for a moment before asking in surprise, "Beast Gems? What use is there in collecting them? They're quite difficult to come by." "I have my own reasons for collecting them. I reckon that in the entire world, the Umbra realm is the only place where one can find Umbra Beast Gems. Even if one could find them elsewhere, they would likely be extremely scarce. Gathering Umbra Beast Gems would have been incredibly difficult if we wished to acquire them when we had first arrived. However, we won't be the ones handling the Umbra Beasts. It will be this one." Han Li suddenly shook his sleeve and a green flash of light appeared before him. Mei Ming glanced at the small monkey that had suddenly appeared with suspicion. "This one?" With a certain expression, Han Li said, "Of course." Because Han Li used the safer routes on his journey to find other villages, he was able to handle the low-grade beasts by using only his flying swords. However, this didn't result in him acquiring any Umbra Beast Gems. Knowing that they had some relation to the puppets of Heaven Void Hall, Han Li naturally wanted to collect a few. At that moment, he called out to Mei Ning and had the Weeping Soul Beast return to his sleeve. He would spend the night at Red Soil Village before setting off and testing the efficacy of the Weeping Soul Beast on Umbra Beasts. A 20-meter-tall clawed beast leisurely walked out of a valley. Its huge claws were overpowering, and its mouth was filled with vicious fangs. As the hegemon of the area, it had no fear of any high-grade Umbra beasts suddenly attacking it. But at that moment, its dull ears suddenly heard something moving, and it turned its head with a malicious light glinting in its eyes. About 100 meters away, a foot-tall monkey had unknowingly appeared. The small monkey was currently staring at the colossal beast with immense excitement. When the huge beast caught sight of the small monkey, it merely snorted several times, wishing to scare it away. However, the monkey actually attacked, shooting out a yellow mist that enveloped it with fantastical speed. After the mist of yellow light enveloped it, the colossal beast released a world-shaking roar. But the yellow mist quickly dimmed and shot back into the small monkey's large nose, carrying streaks of black chi. The small monkey chewed with great relish before patting its bulging belly. Its face appeared completely satisfied, as if it just had a delicious meal. At that moment, Han Li leisurely walked out with a relaxed expression. A flabbergasted Mei Ning followed after him. The woman found this entire scene absurd. She had witnessed the enormous beast turning into a shriveled corpse in the blink of an eye. Another wave of disbelief suddenly crossed her mind when she faintly recalled the legend of a certain fearsome spirit beast. As Mei Ning recovered from her shock, Han Li had already arrived in front of the beast's head. With a wave of his sleeve, a sparkling silver dagger appeared in his hand. He expressionlessly chopped down, splitting the beast's skull like a watermelon. Soon after, a thumb-sized green gem fell out from the remains. Han Li smiled at the sight of it and bent down to pick it up. Han Li then turned his head to the west and assuredly said, "There should be many more powerful Umbra beasts about 3 kilometers west. Let's take care of them along the way." Stormwind Mountain was a huge mountain located in the northeast edge of the Umbra realm. One could only see the bottom half of the mountain from the distance, as the rest of it was densely covered in yin clouds. The mountain was made up of bare black stone and lacked any kind of vegetation. Additionally, it was over 4 kilometers high with storms of fierce yin winds blowing around it. If common men were to climb it, they would only add to the many black ice sculptures already decorating the mountain. The treacherous conditions of the mountain also caused its surroundings to become particularly gloomy. With endless thunder ringing from the skies and cold, howling winds scattering stone and sand, it seemed as if the area was truly haunted. Since places with dense Umbra chi were beloved by powerful Umbra beasts, it was only natural for many fearsome demon beasts to occupy the nearby land. But today, there were some uninvited visitors paying a visit to Stormwind Mountain. A beast carcass that was over 100 meters tall fell onto the ground in a flash of silver light. The carcass then shriveled in an instant as the silver light flew away into the distance, carrying an expanse of black chi. A moment later, a huge world-shaking roar filled the air. Following a series of heavy thuds on the ground, a 30-meter-tall silver ape appeared at the side of the Umbra beast carcass. The huge ape's appearance was malevolent and vicious, with each of its movements exuding an astonishing pressure. However, Han Li and Mei Ning were sitting on its back. Han Li swept his gaze over the beast carcass and pushed off against the ape before deftly landing on the carcass's skull. In the instant he landed, a cold glint flickered in his eyes and the carcass's skull split open, revealing nothing at all. Han Li revealed a trace of disappointment, but his face soon turned back to normal. As of current, he had accumulated over 100 Umbra beast gems. Although he knew there was a small chance that the groups of low-grade Umbra beasts could result in an Umbra beast gem, he didn't have the time to hunt every single one of them down. He had to climb Stormwind Mountain before the next spatial tier appeared. Mei Ning had also jumped down from the huge ape's shoulder. A second later, the huge ape flashed with silver light and shrank to a delicate foot-tall form. Han Li turned around to look at the Weeping Soul Beast's transformation and couldn't help but smile. When he had left Red Soil Village, he had brought the Weeping Soul Beast to many various places to exterminate powerful Umbra beasts. After absorbing large quantities of Umbra beast soul essence, the Weeping Soul Beast had suddenly gained the ability to transform into a huge ape, and not long after, its fur soon turned an eye-catching silver. These changes had come as a great surprise to Han Li. According to the slip that Yuan Yao had given him, the Weeping Soul Beast shouldn't have the ability to enlarge itself, and its fur should have turned pitch black upon advancing instead of silver. It appeared that this peculiar evolution was a result of two aspects that had coincidentally met. Umbra beast soul essence that greatly differed from the soul essence commonly found in the outside world, and the fact that the beast wasn't completely refined in the first place. It wasn't as miraculous as the commonly known variant spirit beasts, but its peculiar transformation was absolutely the first of its kind. Although he didn't know whether or not this transformation resulted in strength greater than true Weeping Soul Beasts, Han Li was quite content after seeing these changes continue. After all, the refinement method of a true Weeping Soul Beast was a bloody affair. Although Han Li wasn't a soft person, he would have found it difficult to refine it according to the methods that he was given. At that moment, the Weeping Soul Beast shot into Han Li's sleeve with a flash of white and silver light, and deep breaths of sleep could be heard. Han Li faintly smiled in response, but soon his face grew solemn when he gazed at Stormwind Mountain in the distance. That previous Umbra beast had been the last remaining giant Umbra beast near Stormwind Mountain. They were now free to climb the mountain without obstruction. Han Li took a deep glance at the distant mountain and slowly said, "Let's go. We have to climb to the top of the mountain before the next spatial tier appears. Otherwise, we'll be stuck here several more months. Mei Ning agreed. Of course. According to the natives' method of predicting these intermittent spatial tiers, the next tier should appear in about 2 weeks. If we were to miss it, we'd have to wait another half-year. Han Li faintly smiled and took the lead towards the huge mountain. A quarter-hour later, the two stood at the base of Stormwind Mountain. Although they didn't feel anything from that distance, they were awed as they stood before the mountain. There were no neighboring mountains, only several kilometers of a single, steep mountain. Han Li didn't immediately start off on his climb. He first turned to Mei Ning and discussed the method that would be best to climb the gargantuan mountain. Not long after, the two became two black dots that slowly disappeared from sight as they gradually made their way up. The first 4 kilometers weren't particularly difficult or strenuous for Han Li and Mei Ning, and they made their way up without much effort. But after that point, the bone-chilling yin winds began to blow at faster speeds and with greater force. At that point, Han Li and Mei Ning covered themselves in several articles of fire attribute beast hide clothing, but even with this, their faces paled as the cold winds tore their skin. Were they ordinary mortals, they would have long since met their end by freezing over. After persisting for another 100 meters through the yin wind, Han Li stopped with a frown and solemnly pondered for a moment before taking out a fist-sized white gem from within his robes. The gem released a faint white luster that quickly enveloped the two. The piercing yin winds were greatly weakened upon touching the white light and were no longer strong enough to do them harm. As a result, the two were able to arduously continue their ascent, relying on their beast hide clothes to resist the iciness of the air. Eventually, the ground became covered in frost and their footing became slippery, forcing the two of them to slow their ascent and walk with caution. Additionally, their breaths became visible, and it became increasingly more difficult for them to breathe. Mei Ning in particular was gasping for air with a completely flushed face. After an unknown amount of time passed as they continued on their trek, they found themselves before a precipitous expanse of glistening black ice. If one wasn't careful as they climbed, they would find themselves falling off the mountain. On their way, Han Li and Mei Ning had already put on rough-scaled gloves out of necessity. Even with the gloves, the trek to that point had been incredibly difficult, and the two would often lose their grip on the black frost. Han Li raised his head to look at the top of the glistening cliff and sighed. He then turned his head to the pale-faced woman at his side and said, "Let's take a moment to rest beneath that cliff over there. We'll continue onward after we recover our strength." Although she hadn't said anything, Han Li could tell at a glance that her strength was nearly exhausted. It would be quite dangerous if she continued in this condition. When Mei Ning heard this, she let out a long breath and nodded with a forced smile. The huge cliff that Han Li spoke of was actually an inwardly slanted stone cliff. The appearance of such good shelter was quite timely, and the two hastily made their way towards it. Fog and howling winds blew on the outside as Han Li and Mei Ning walked beneath the cliff. With a cautious expression, Han Li took out a thumb-sized bead that he wore on his wrist and had it emit a faint azure light. Just as the fog approached them, the azure light forcibly repelled the fog. However, the fog still lingered nearby as if it were waiting for an opportunity to draw closer. Mei Ning glanced at the fog and said, "It seems that if it weren't for Brother Han's matron screen pearl, we would have been unable to make it past the yin wind's strange fog." Han Li smiled and thought to say something when he suddenly froze and began to concentrate on his hearing. When Mei Ning saw this, she was somewhat shocked and discreetly kept quiet. Han Li indifferently said, "Be careful, someone is approaching us from within the fog." With a glint of azure light, an azure dagger appeared in his hand. He then stared into the fog in silence. With complete confidence in Han Li's words, Mei Ning immediately took a few steps back and stared outward with a nervous expression. Not long after, Mei Ning heard the sound of soft and heavy footsteps slowly drawing closer to them. She nervously glanced at Han Li, who seemed to notice her gaze and gently smiled in response. Mei Ning unconsciously blushed and quickly focused her eyes away from Han Li, but she felt somewhat relieved as well. As the footsteps grew clearer, Han Li could hear the faint gasps of 2 people, much to his surprise. Han Li frowned, and a trace of killing intent glinted within his eyes. Suddenly, the thick fog parted and revealed a young man with his head held high. He had an elegant face and wore a jade band around his waist that faintly appeared to shine with white light. However, when the man caught sight of Han Li, his face immediately distorted as he shouted in alarm, "It's you." This man was the disciple of Archsaint Six Paths, Wen Tianren. Han Li expressionlessly said, "That's right, it's me. You can now rest in peace." With a flicker of azure light, Han Li tossed the dagger into the center of Wei Tianren's chest. Peng, the dagger was easily knocked away as if it had struck metal. The torn clothes revealed a faint flicker of green light. Inner armor. Han Li was somewhat surprised that his strike was ineffective, but he snorted and waved his other hand, throwing another azure streak. This time, it was aimed at Wen Tianren's throat. At that moment, Wen Tianren reacted and dodged in alarm, his body evading the dagger in a blur. Just as the dagger missed, he shot into the fog behind him. It appeared his body was quite vigorous. With yet another attack missing, Han Li merely glanced at Wen Tianren's fleeing figure. He remained still with a sneer on his face. And when Tianren quickly turned his head around and saw Han Li's expression, he immediately felt that something was amiss and he turned around in a blur. But by then, it was already too late. He felt a piercing cold wind on the back of his neck, followed by an icy sensation where the dagger struck him. The semi-transparent string of beast tendon that was tied around the dagger hilt was stretched taut. A stream of blood then began to flow from Wen Tianren's corpse. His eyes remained wide open during his last moments, as if he couldn't believe that he had died in this manner. Han Li expressionlessly shook his right hand with his finger pulling on the taut tendon. The dagger then obediently flew out from Wen Tianren's neck and returned to his palm. At that moment, Han Li turned his gaze back into the dense fog and narrowed his eyes. A slim figure then slowly appeared from the fog, revealing a gorgeous young woman dressed in white. The woman smiled sweetly at Han Li and said, "Brother Han, I didn't think that we'd meet again." "Lady Violet Spirit." Han Li nodded with a calm expression and had his two daggers disappear into his sleeves with a shake of his hands. Naturally, Han Li knew Fairy Violet Spirit's greatly changed appearance after hearing her conversation with Wen Tianren when he was trapped inside the golden flames. After seeing her true appearance, Han Li couldn't help but concede that Fairy Violet Spirit's grand reputation as one of the most beautiful women in the scattered star seas was well deserved. Even Yuan Yao's magnificent, breathtaking beauty was a smidgen less than Violet Spirit's. But at that moment, Violet Spirit glanced down at the corpse on the ground and sighed. "I truly didn't think that the self-proclaimed top core formation cultivator, young Master Wen, would meet his end at fellow Taoist Han's hand. If this were told to others, I suspect that most of them wouldn't believe it. Since I encountered him in this place, I naturally couldn't let him go," Han Li calmly replied. He then walked to the side of Wen Tianren's corpse and took his storage pouch without reservation. At that same moment, he took a glance at the jade cloud belt with curiosity. Violet Spirit pursed her lips in a smile and explained, "That is the Four Celestials belt. It is embedded with 4 miraculous gems that are capable of resisting wind, fire, water, and earth. Additionally, it is capable of keeping one's mind calm. It truly is a rare treasure." He had relied much on this belt to journey in this land without obstruction. "The Four Celestials belt, it will prove quite useful at the moment." After some hesitation, he bent down and took the belt off of Wen Tianren's corpse. He then searched through the corpse without reservation and found a dark green plate of inner armor along with several other treasures. "Brother Han, who might this fellow Taoist be?" Violet Spirit's bright gaze then turned to Mei Ning behind him. Han Li calmly replied, "That is Lady Mei. She's a fellow Taoist who was teleported alongside me." "So it's Lady Mei. I've had the pleasure of seeing you before." Mei Ning felt somewhat awkward, but she gazed at Violet Spirit with curiosity regardless. Fairy Violet Spirit was undoubtedly worthy of a grand reputation. Even Mei Ning remained mesmerized by her beauty for a while. She couldn't help but guess at the relationship between the two. Fairy Violet Spirit kindly smiled at Mei Ning and revealed an apologetic expression to Han Li, "Fellow Taoist Han, please don't blame me for not assisting you that day. At the time." Han Li waved his hand and interrupted her with a casual tone. "There is no need for Lady Violet Spirit to speak of it. Although I don't know why you were together with Wen Tianren, I was able to see your unwillingness to be with him. Moreover, I clearly remember that you refused to act against my companion in the valley." Fairy Violet Spirit inwardly sighed with relief upon seeing that Han Li wasn't angry with her and immediately smiled, saying, "Since Brother Han has already recognized my difficulties, then I will say no more. However, would it be possible for me to travel alongside you too? Of course, you've already walked halfway into the fog and it would be difficult to turn back. Since we've already made it this far, there is no point in wasting the effort." "Many thanks, Brother Han." Fairy Violet Spirit's moist eyes began to shine, revealing an incomparable beauty. Not long after, The three disappeared into the mist, leaving behind Wen Tianren's frozen corpse. At the same moment, a strange scene was occurring inside a cave. A gorgeous woman sat cross-legged on the ground across from a ghostly image surrounded in black qi. The ghost was also sitting cross-legged. Although it appeared quite vague, it was reminiscent of a young woman. Junior Martial Sister, have you truly decided to cultivate the yin-yang revolutions with me? It doesn't seem to be a wise decision. A somewhat unfamiliar woman's voice urged against it. Senior Martial Sister Yan should know that because my original core was already shattered from using the Soul Rise technique, I had nearly cut off my path of cultivation. Furthermore, I didn't expect that after paying such a heavy cost that the Soul Rise technique would be interrupted by the sudden appearance of the ghost mist. Because Senior Martial Sister's soul has greatly condensed, she no longer has any hope of possessing a body. But fortunately, there is a silver lining. There is dense umbra chi here is quite beneficial to those cultivating ghost Dao techniques. As for the yin-yang revolution arts, it is a rarely seen human-ghost pair cultivation technique. By taking advantage of the umbra chi, not only will Senior Martial Sister's cultivation quickly increase, but I will also have a chance of returning to core formation stage. Even nascent soul stage wouldn't be impossible. Yuan Yao spoke with complete calmness. Since it's like that, I won't refuse any longer. However, I must warn Junior Martial Sister that, although the technique will be incredibly effective by drawing support from the umbra chi, you will suffer dire backlash and will also lose your right to reincarnation. You should consider it carefully. There is a reason why no one in the Azure Yang sect used the cultivation art despite possessing it for so long. The ghost woman seemed to have spoken the last two sentences with a trace of helplessness. Junior Martial Sister doesn't need to say any further. I've already made my decision. There will be no regrets. Yuan Yao wore an expression of grave resolution. All right, since Junior Martial Sister doesn't fear the consequences, then I won't regard them either. Let us cultivate the yin-yang revolution's art. After a long sigh from the vague ghost, it extended its two arms of black qi. When Yuan Yao saw this, she extended her hands without hesitation and closed her eyes upon contact, setting forth on the path of cultivation once more. On a flat cliff on Stormwind Mountain stood a huge silver ape that was over 40 meters tall. It was beating its chest while carrying Han Li, Mei Ning, and Violet Spirit on its back. Han Li gravely stared at the sky in silence, while the two women's faces were pale, faintly revealing a trace of panic. There were over 1,000 umbra beasts circling above them. There were beasts that were over 20 meters in length along with those that were only a foot long, all with wings that sprouted out from between their ribs. But regardless of size, they all looked fierce and malevolent without exception. However, these flying umbra beasts seemed to fear the overbearing pressure of the transformed weeping soul beast and didn't dare to draw closer to them. They merely stayed in a deadlock by flying in circles above them. Han Li felt somewhat uneasy. From the greed revealed inside the umbra beast's eyes, it was unclear how long their patience would hold before they started to attack. At the moment, Han Li was cursing the plump old man who had given him the information regarding the mountain. Although he did say that there were flying umbra beasts, he didn't say that they existed in such large quantities. It was unknown whether it had been deliberately concealed or if it truly wasn't known. After passing through the area with the dense fog, they had originally believed that they could have a moment of respite. However, they didn't expect for these flying beasts to immediately surround them. Helpless, Han Li could only release the weeping soul beast and have it transform. Han Li was completely confident in the weeping soul beast's abilities at restraining umbra beasts, but there were truly too many in the sky. Han Li was unsure if the weeping soul beast could deal with so many of them, but having reached this point, Han Li couldn't afford to think about it much more and could only do his utmost. Having come to that conclusion, Han Li turned around and whispered something to the scared Mei Ning and Violet Spirit. Afterwards, he handed them a small piece of jade and a soft beast hide shield. He then shook his sleeves, and over 10 daggers fell onto the ground with a series of clangs. Each of the daggers had a thin string of beast tendon tied around the hilt, connecting them to each of Han Li's fingers. However, Han Li had yet to control 10 of them at one time, making it an unprecedented display. With his preparations completed, the umbra beasts above finally lost their patience and attacked. The largest among them, a 3-headed umbra beast, suddenly let out a terrifying shriek and swooped down without any regard for the weeping soul beast's strength. The battle had finally begun. At the same moment the demon beasts attacked, the huge ape took a deep breath and shut its mouth before spewing a mist of silver light from its nose, enveloping most of the umbra beasts in the air. These umbra beasts immediately released a miserable shriek as they dropped from the sky. However, two of the smaller umbra beasts managed to escape the mist's capture and swept down towards the three humans. One of the umbra beasts was then smashed away by the huge apes first and fell over a cliff. As for the other, it appeared to be a 2-meter-long eagle and took advantage of this opening to swoop down right at Han Li's head. Han Li grimly remained in place, but his fingers made a series of swift and nimble movements. 10 daggers then shot into the air and turned into a net of glinting daggers in the umbra beast's path. A dismal scream left the umbra beast's mouth. Even without the infusion of magic power, the bamboo cloudswarm swords were incredibly sharp. In an instant, the small umbra beast was skewered without resistance. As bloody chunks of flesh filled the sky, Han Li quickly dodged in a blur, but some of them still landed on him. After a slight grimace, he paid it no more attention as there were far more pressing matters at hand. Another wave of winged umbra beasts was flying towards them. This wave had twice the number of the previous group of umbra beasts. Additionally, there were more umbra beasts approaching them from behind with an obvious eagerness to attack. Han Li's mind grew stern, and he instantly waved his arms, forming a net of swords yet again. However, the net now covered a slightly wider range that also protected Mei Ning and Violet Spirit. Following the mists of silver light and the azure glints, wretched screams quickly filled the sky. 7 days later, under the scorchingly bright noon sun, an expanse of glimmering sea was deathly calm. There wasn't even the slightest wave or sea breeze, as if the nearby sea was completely void of life. Suddenly, a series of waves began to roil, and suddenly released a cloud of black fog. The pitch-black fog rapidly permeated throughout the air and instantly spread over several hundred meters. At that moment, thunder began to clap and silver light flashed from the black fog before a sphere of silver radiance appeared from within it. A faint, wide silhouette with a pair of silver wings could be seen within. Before this figure could be clearly seen, the silver radiance wildly flashed several times before completely disappearing, leaving only echoes of thunder behind. A second later, a person could be seen at the edge of the black mist, but he intermittently disappeared and reappeared, filling the sky with flickers of light and rolls of thunder. It appeared as if they wished to escape from that desolate place as quickly as possible. The sea then returned to silence. Only the rapidly expanding black fog remained, continuing to silently release bursts of black lightning. About 500 kilometers away from the black mist, the silver light faded away to reveal Han Li holding Violet's Spirit in one arm and Mei Ning in the other. From how tightly they were holding onto him, it appeared quite intimate. Han Li appeared somewhat better off than the other two. Despite his overwhelmed senses, he managed to keep a calm face. However, the two women in his embrace were slightly scarlet, revealing a heart-moving tenderness. Han Li took a glance around and wore an expression of relief. He then relaxed his grasp on the two women in an honorable manner and said, "This should be enough. The ghost mist can't reach us now. I must truly give my thanks to fellow Taoist Han. If it weren't for your miraculous movement technique, it's quite likely that we wouldn't have been able to escape. Elder sister Violet Spirit speaks truly. If it weren't for brother Han's amazingly swift actions, we may have been sucked back into the Umbra realm. We've troubled brother Han greatly." As soon as Violet Spirit and Mei Ning left Han Li's embrace, their bodies began to shine with light as they floated at Han Li's side. Several days before, the three had encountered many dangers, but managed to climb up to Stormwind Mountain's summit by relying on the Weeping Soul Beast's strength. During the time they waited for the spatial tier to open, the two women found each other's company extremely agreeable, and not long after, they became sworn sisters, much to Han Li's surprise. Several days after reaching the summit, a 100-meter-wide spatial tier appeared about a kilometer above Stormwind Mountain. Massive amounts of heaven-earth spiritual chi began to flow in from the outside, restoring the trio's magic power in an instant and allowing them to fly into the air with joy. However, Han Li truly didn't expect that, in the instant he left the tier, that an immense suction force would pull at him from behind. He hadn't been able to move in the slightest and was slowly being dragged back in. Fortunately, Han Li quickly came to his senses and immediately unfolded the thunderstorm wings as he flickered several times to grab onto the two women, before launching himself out of the black mist. As a result, the two gave him their heartfelt thanks. When Violet's Spirit recovered her bearings, she casually swept her gaze over the ocean and frowned. "Where is this place? How can it be so odd? It's completely calm." Mei Ning's face appeared puzzled after taking a glance down. "What? It is truly as elder sister Violet Spirit says. This is quite a miss. There isn't the slightest breeze and the seas are completely still. Han Li remained silent as he narrowed his eyes and released his spiritual sense. He began to sweep the depths of the nearby seas, and after a short moment, Han Li revealed an expression of shock. Violet Spirit had also swept her spiritual sense deep into the seas, and after a moment, her beautiful eyes were filled with shock. Could it be Brother Han has discovered something? There are so few fish in the sea, and they all seem to be extremely fierce sea beasts. However, none of them appear to be demon beasts. Please wait a moment. Han Li then took a deep breath and flicked his finger, shooting a 10-meter streak of azure swordlight deep into the waters below. A short moment later, a grotesque sea beast corpse floated to the water's surface, much to the shock of the two women. The sea beast corpse before them was over a dozen meters long. It had azure scales on its body and small, sharp teeth. It also had massively swollen eyes. It appeared quite fiendish, but what was most noticeable about its appearance were the crooked tusks that grew from the bottom of its cheeks. Han Li grew closer to the corpse and carefully examined it several times before a flicker of understanding appeared in his eyes. He then cleaved the demon corpse into two with a streak of swordlight. With a wave of his hand, a pitch-black item flew into his grasp. He took a whiff of it without any hesitation and found that it had an odd pungent smell that faintly contained a trace of flowery fragrance. Han Li tossed the item away and revealed a strange expression as he muttered, "So it's a fragrant tusk beast." Fragrant tusk beast. Violet Spirit was stunned and glanced at Mei Ning. The two women revealed a trace of confusion as it was their first time of hearing such a name. It is natural that you two wouldn't know of this sea beast. These beasts are absent in the scattered star seas. They are unique to these strange depths. Fairy Violet Spirit gravely said, "From your tone, it seems Brother Han already knows that we are no longer in the scattered star seas." Han Li swept his gaze past the dull ocean and nodded his head with a wry smile. "That is correct. We are no longer in the scattered star seas. Although I've never been here before, I've heard many people speak of it. If I haven't guessed incorrectly, this place should be the endless seas." He then turned his head to the sky and silently became lost in thought. The endless seas. They clearly hadn't heard of this name before. Violet Spirit muttered to herself before wearing a smile and gently asking, "Brother Han seems to hold some knowledge of these seas. Could you give us sisters an explanation?" Han Li awoke from his indescribable wave of emotion, calmly nodded his head. "Of course, that won't be a problem. As the term implies, the endless seas is known to the heavenly south region to be without end. Han Li leisurely began to speak of the legends and hearsays of the endless seas in full detail. At the same time he spoke, a question buried deeply in his heart began to surface after remaining there for such a long time. With a tone of astonishment, Violet Spirit said, "From Brother Han's words, this endless seas should be north of the heavenly south region. And not only is there little life in these seas, but there also exists no islands." Han Li rubbed his nose and calmly replied, "That's right, much to our great distress. Without islands, we fundamentally have no method of determining our location. We have no way of knowing how far we are from the heavenly south continent." The two women couldn't help but look at each other in dismay. After some thought, Han Li firmly said, "Regardless, we must head south without delay and reach the mainland before we run out of spirit stones. Hopefully it won't be too far away." Violet Spirit agreed with a trace of helplessness. "Since that is the case, we can only hope that the heavens favor us." Mei Ning naturally followed along without complaint. As a result, the three recognized their bearings before immediately heading south. Several days later, Mei Ning and Violet Spirit became entirely convinced of Han Li's judgments. During their entire journey, there were no islands to speak of, and the sea was completely void of qi. Additionally, there wasn't a single demon beast in the oceans, only fierce-looking sea beasts. When these women discovered these circumstances for the first time, they were completely baffled. Perhaps due to their previous experiences of having undergone tribulations together, the three behaved quite harmoniously and bantered along the journey. As for Han Li, he couldn't help but feel his heart stir in the presence of these two beautiful women. However, now that he had arrived at the endless seas, the face of an icy woman came to mind. Nangong Wan. It was unknown where this masked moon sect core formation cultivator had gone, but when he thought of her, a strange emotion began to well in his heart. He couldn't tell whether it was foolish attachment, tender affection, or annoyance, as if 1,000 different feelings had muddled his mind. He couldn't make heads of what he currently felt. Regardless, The party of three continued their flight for 4 months before eventually spotting an expanse of green on the horizon. The three were immensely rejoiced at the sight, and their most pressing worry was relieved. They then flew towards the mainland in excitement. The state of Xi was the heavenly south region's northmost country. It was about a third smaller than Han Li's home country, the state of Yue, and it was divided into 7 provinces. The Min province was the largest province among them, and was also the one that neighbored the endless seas. As of current, Han Li had brought Mei Ning and Violet Spirit to a restaurant's private room in a small city of the Min province. Violet Spirit coquettishly glanced at Han Li in feigned anger and said, "Brother Han, so it turned out that you came from the heavenly south region. You've sure put us through a bit of trouble for having hid this so well." Not long before, Han Li had divulged a few small details about his identity, astonishing the two women. Of course, the two had already guessed as much considering Han Li's familiarity with the endless seas, so it hadn't come with too much surprise. Han Li hoarsely laughed, appearing to be in a good mood. "What is there to say? I unintentionally fled to the scattered star seas. I truly didn't expect to be brought back to the heavenly south so soon." Violet Spirit pursed her lips in a smile and playfully said, "Since Brother Han is a lord of the land, he must properly entertain us sisters, of course." Because she feared that her stunning beauty would arouse trouble, she had already restored her original appearance to when she had first met Han Li. However, Han Li still felt shaken by her beauty as if he could see it through her disguise. Of course. However, I've lost all relation to my sect after fleeing to the scattered star seas. How could I possibly be a lord of this land? However, I'm going to give you each a jade slip that I made in particular to translate the script and language of the heavenly south. Since you won't be able to return to the scattered star seas for a while, you may as well learn the language. It will make things far more convenient in the future." Han Li then took out 2 white jade slips he had made the previous night and handed it over to them. Many thanks, Brother Han." Violet Spirit was initially stunned. She soon thanked him, chuckled, and accepted the jade slip. Mei Ning also took the jade slip and gratefully whispered thanks. "However, I imagine you two will have your plans for the future. As for me, I will be preparing to inquire what has happened in the heavenly south region the past couple hundred years before immediately finding a cave residence for secluded cultivation. Because I've faintly felt that I've already reached the peak of core formation stage, I want to make preparations to form a nascent soul." After Han Li said this, he sipped on the fragrant tea before him and lightly pursed his lips, calmly paying attention to the women's reaction in front of them. After a moment of consideration, Violet Spirit's luminous eyes rippled as she said, "I've only formed a core just recently, and I've yet to stabilize my cultivation. I also intend on finding a cave residence to cultivate for a time before further planning what to do. Little sister Mei, what do you intend on doing?" After a moment of hesitation, she muttered, I don't know. I've only reached mid-foundation establishment stage. Based on my aptitude, my hopes of reaching core formation are quite slim. Apart from finding a heaven-defying spirit medicine, my only hope is to find a high-grade cultivator and marry him as a concubine. Perhaps I will be able to form a core through pair cultivation." Violet Spirit shook her head and dissuaded her. "Don't you feel indignity from marrying as a concubine? How will that do?" Han Li frowned in response, but he remained silent. Violet Spirit continued, "Becoming a concubine isn't much different from becoming a cultivation vessel. If you were to come across a malicious high-grade cultivator, it wouldn't be unimaginable for him to regard you as a cultivation vessel. This plan isn't reliable." When Mei Ning heard this, she bit her lips in silence with a sad expression on her face. After seeing Mei Ning's sad face, Violet Spirit suddenly thought of something and covered her smile in her hand before saying, "Even if little sister wishes to become a concubine for pair cultivation techniques, then it would be best to find a reliable person you are familiar with. For example, I feel like Brother Han would be very reliable and wouldn't wrong little sister in the slightest." Han Li was shocked, but soon he calmly rubbed his nose as if this had nothing to do with him. Mei Ning then let out a gasp of surprise and her face soon blushed, revealing a gorgeous allure. She then lowered her head in silence as if she didn't oppose Violet Spirit's scheme. After all, Han Li held deep cultivation that had already reached late core formation stage. Although he was about to prepare to condense a nascent soul, from her experience in the Umbra realm, she came to realize that Han Li wasn't an insidious or unfeeling person. As a result, even if she didn't have the qualifications to become his Tao companion, she would be quite satisfied to become his concubine. With her alluring beauty and cultivation, it was inevitable that she would attach herself to a powerful male cultivator. Else, she would encounter great difficulty in the cultivation world, or worse, she would immensely suffer at the hands of others. And with her brother gone, she only had herself to rely on, causing a dreadful encounter to become all the more likely. The atmosphere in their private room suddenly became exceptionally stale following Violet Spirit's words. Seeing that Han Li remained silent, Fairy Violet Spirit smiled and asked, "Brother Han, how do you feel about marrying her? Little sister Mei Ning's beautiful appearance should more than qualify her enough to become your concubine. Surely you wouldn't refuse such a pleasant matter that has come knocking on your door." Han Li unconsciously frowned and turned to look at the charming, bright appearance of Mei Ning. Mei Ning held her head low, and a faint blush was revealed from her snow-white neck, making for a rather touching scene. It seemed she had tacitly agreed with Violet Spirit's proposal. Han Li slowly spoke with a calm expression. Based on her appearances alone, she wouldn't qualify as a mere concubine of a high-grade cultivator. Even being a Dao companion wouldn't be out of the question. However, I am different from common cultivators. I have dedicated myself to the pursuit of immortality and cannot easily involve myself with the affairs of men and women. Furthermore, I am a lone wanderer and often encounter perilous situations. How could I possibly take in a concubine? If fellow Taoist Mei were to follow me, it wouldn't be a good thing for her at all. It would only lead her down a path of unprecedented hardship. Mei Ning's body faintly trembled upon hearing him, and her blush hastily faded away. She only raised her head to reveal a paled face. As if greatly discontent with Han Li's refusal of the beautiful woman, Violet Spirit annoyedly said, "But in the end, Brother Han is still rejecting her. Needless to say, with your late core formation cultivation, who could possibly pose a threat to you apart from nascent soul eccentrics? Perhaps fellow Taoist may soon succeed in condensing a nascent soul. After that, the entire world would be free to roam as you choose. How would you be unable to protect little sister Mei Ning?" Han Li flatly said, "Fellow Taoist Violet Spirit should already be aware. Although I believe myself to be a level higher than similar grade cultivators, I've always provoked enmity from foes far stronger than I until I reach nascent soul stage and possess enough power to defend myself. I cannot possibly consider taking in a concubine. When the time comes that I am incapable of defending her, she will only face a bitter reality." Violet Spirit creased her brow, knowing that Han Li had spoken truthfully. Moreover, she faintly felt that Han Li was somewhat displeased. She could only sigh and avoid further mentioning the topic. Mei Ning eventually recovered her calm and bit her lips while staring at Han Li and asking, "Since Brother Han didn't reject this little woman based on her lacking appeal, would you be willing to accept me after you enter nascent soul stage?" Han Li looked at the woman and calmly said, "Nascent soul stage. I don't have any certainty that I will be able to condense a nascent soul. Furthermore, even if I am able to reach the nascent soul stage, I have no idea about how many years it will take. Would fellow Taoists may be willing to wait over 100 years for an uncertain chance that I would able to condense a nascent soul?" When Mei Ning heard this, her expression grew unclear and she was incapable of responding. As a foundation establishment cultivator, even 30 years was too long, let alone 100. Although Han Li made for a very good choice for pair cultivation, she didn't have the time to wait for an uncertain result. After all, the cultivation world was a truly cruel place. Although she had only spent a short amount of time together with Han Li and had a favorable impression of him, it was impossible for her to have fallen so completely in love with him that she'd ignore the consequences. Seeing her hesitation, Han Li could only inwardly sigh and place 2 bottles onto the table before pushing them towards her. Han Li unhurriedly said, "These are a few cultivation progression pills that I concocted from demon cores. Instead of seeking a man to pair cultivate with, it may be better to diligently cultivate by yourself. Perhaps you'll even form a golden core like fellow Taoist Violet Spirit." Since these medicine pills were for foundation establishment cultivators, they no longer had any value to Han Li, but since the woman had passed on her transient spirit chi to him, he may as well use this opportunity to repay the favor without much effort. As such, he would no longer need to dwell on the matter. Medicine pills concocted from demon cores. Mei Ning appeared moved and unconsciously reached for one. After opening the bottle's lid, a fragrant odor instantly filled the room. "These are top-grade medicine pills." Mei Ning then stared at Han Li in confusion. She was at a complete loss for words. Han Li had treated her with such amorous disregard in the Umbra realm, but he then refused to take her in as a concubine. Even more baffling, he had then taken out precious medicine pills for her. Fairy Violet's spirit glanced at the medicine pills with a trace of astonishment, but she immediately chuckled. He. Brother Han is truly magnanimous. Since fellow Taoist Han has said as much, little sister should accept them. Perhaps with a few more medicine pills, you will truly be able to enter core formation. If that were to occur, us sisters should join hands so that we may travel unfettered. Mei Ning glanced at Han Li with a complicated expression and whispered a word of thanks before taking the small medicine bottles into her storage pouch. Han Li faintly smiled in response and turned towards the window, glancing down at the small city streets. It was bustling with activity, reminding Han Li of a familiar scene that he had long forgotten. His smile then turned into a faint sigh. Seeing that Han Li wore such an expression, Violet's spirit and Mei Ning couldn't help but glance at each other in confusion. Nan province was located in the western portion of the state of Zai. The land there was quite complicated, containing many hills and jungles with the occasional swamp miasma occasionally wandering the land. As a result, there were only a few main roads connecting the several villages in the area, and few ever tread into the wilderness. As for the mountain ranges, they were home to particularly vicious beasts, deterring anyone from visiting them. This had caused the area to be abundant with rare medicinal herbs and beasts, much to the joy of the country's cultivators. This had led to a majority of the country's cultivators to be located in this province. A few of the more powerful cultivator sects even monopolized a few of the areas with the more abundant spiritual qi. As for the mountain range in the province known as the Dreamcloud Mountains, it was an area famed in the heavenly south for its sacred spirit veins. In the profound spirit veins of the mountain grew the legendary spirit well tree, the final type of the three divine woods. Local powers held this tree in even greater esteem than the heaven-lightning bamboo and soul-nurturing wood because of a spirit milk that was produced by the tree every 200 years known as wine nectar. Although the liquid couldn't be directly used, it could be refined into many types of exceptionally powerful spiritual medicines. Among these was a legendary sacred medicine known as the Spirit Tempering Pill. The Spirit Tempering Pill was also known as the Soul Pacifying Pill. Not only could it increase one's cultivation a certain amount, it could also harden one's heart and calm one's soul, alleviating a cultivator of any inner demons that may haunt them. Condensing a nascent soul was quite unlike forming a core. Apart from requiring a certain degree of luck and depth of cultivation, condensing a nascent soul also subjected oneself to the disturbances of illusions and inner demons. After all, transforming one's core into a nascent soul was a fearsome test of mental endurance and willpower. Heaven-defying treasure of the Dreamcloud Mountains, spirit veins, with the addition of the extraordinary concentration of spiritual qi that it contained, had attracted countless sects with the desire to establish their base there. As a result of endless battles and subterfuge, the territory was currently being held by an alliance of three sects: the Ancient Sword Sect, the Drifting Cloud Sect, and the 100 Possibilities Pavilion. With the three strongest forces in the state of Zai combining power, other sects could only extinguish any hopes of seizing the spirit veins and watch helplessly. Sitting down on the steps of one of the peaks of the Dreamcloud Mountains, Han Li was pondering over information that had to do with the mountains and was examining the nearby environment. There were a few young men and women silently walking on the mountain paths, each with an expression of excitement. When Han Li saw this, he faintly smiled. As the great Drifting Cloud Sect was about to recruit a new batch of new disciples in the coming days, these qi condensation youths were brimming with anticipation. Having spent half a month in this place, it was only natural that he knew of this. Their famed pill concoction technique was one of various reasons he chose to infiltrate the sect. However, he wasn't going to enter as a core formation cultivator, but an ordinary qi condensation cultivator. Unless a mid-nascent soul cultivator were to closely examine him, none would be able to see through the miraculous effects of the nameless qi restraining incantation. It was only because of this that he dared to follow through with his plan. When he suddenly recalled what happened before he had parted with Violet's spirit and Mei Ning, he bitterly chuckled. According to his original plans, he had found a place to establish a cave residence and consumed a few medicine pills in order to reach the peak of core formation stage. While the transient spirit qi had progressed his cultivation somewhat, it wasn't enough to genuinely advance him into false nascent stage. However, something unexpected occurred that had completely overturned his plans. When he took a medicine pill, he astonishedly discovered that the medicine pill had completely lost effect for him. Regardless of whether it was the grade 6 demon beast pills or the grade 7 demon beasts, they all had no effect on him. He was left at a complete loss. Han Li had anticipated that the medicine pills would eventually lose their effect on him. While medicine pills are able to rapidly progress one's cultivation, it possessed its own flaws. When one's magic power reached a certain level, the original medicine pills would lack the medicinal power to be effective. Additionally, with his meridians being purified from the lingering effects of the rainbow beads and his continuously increases in magic power, Han Li became capable of absorbing more spiritual power in one instance. He had reached a stage where his speed at absorbing heaven-earth spiritual qi was nearly the same as absorbing spiritual power from medicine pills. Of course, this resulted in medicine pills gradually losing their original efficacy. Consequently, even if Han Li took a large amount of foundation establishment-level pills, they would have no effect on him. However, his current predicament with the ineffective pills was caused from him crossing through entirely different worlds. This was something he couldn't have possibly anticipated. Both the Jade Slips and the Nascent Soul Cultivator's experiences both mentioned that, while Grade 6 Demon Cores might have no longer been useful, Grade 7 Demon Core medicine pills should be effective before a nascent soul is formed. However, they now had hardly any effect on him. After some careful thought, he could only accept that the medicine pills had lost their effectiveness earlier than anticipated, and he had finally become resistant to medicine again. Of course, Han Li guessed that this also may have something to do with either Feng Zai's Jadefire wine or Mei Ning's transient spirit qi. One was an item that humans should have never been able to drink, while the other was one known to be one of the 7 purest spiritual qi in the world. It would be quite ordinary for their use to have repercussions. Since these circumstances have already occurred, there was no point in investigating the true cause of the loss of medicinal effectiveness, since it could no longer be changed. He was unwilling to spend a large amount of effort on something that would be fruitless. Instead, he began to think of plans for the future. He still had the demon core of the Grade 8 Flood Dragon in his hand, but since it was such a precious material that could hardly be found, he was completely unwilling to refine it into a medicine pill since there was such a high chance of failure. Additionally, this would result in only 1 or 2 pills. It wouldn't be enough to bring him to false nascent stage. As a result, his only choice was to strenuously cultivate to increase his magic power a bit at a time, just like everyone else. It was just that he hadn't experienced such slow progress for quite a long time. With that thought, Han Li couldn't help but bitterly smile. Fortunately, he was only a short distance away from reaching the peak core formation stage. He figured that if he was provided with an abundant amount of spiritual qi, it would only take him about 10 years' worth of effort. As such, he had to find a place with acceptable spirit veins. If he were to cultivate in an area with weak spiritual qi, it would take him several times longer, an unacceptable result. But when speaking of spirit veins, the heavenly south region and the scattered star seas were quite different. The scattered star seas had an abundance of islands and few people with free land as far as the eye could see. There were countless islands with as many unclaimed spirit veins. Contrarily, the land in the heavenly south was fixed, but there were also many people. Although the area can be considered large, all of the notable spirit veins had already been occupied by sects and cultivator clans of all sizes. Even the areas with meager spiritual qi that had escaped their notice were already taken up by vagrant cultivators. There was nothing valuable left. With sole regards to natural cultivation resources, the heavenly south region was far too lacking in comparison with the scattered star seas. Under these circumstances, Han Li could only sneak into a cultivator clan or sect if he wished to continue his cultivation. While Han Li's current abilities would allow him to forcefully seize any spirit veins belonging to a cultivation clan or smaller sects and take them over, he feared this would immediately cause him to come under the notice of nascent soul cultivators once again. Han Li was done with being pursued by nascent soul eccentrics and only wished to condense his nascent soul in peace. But when cultivator clans came to mind, Han Li immediately rejected the idea. What cultivator clan would have the power to occupy an exceptional spirit veins? None of them would be to his satisfaction. Moreover, outsiders would never be able to mingle inside a cultivator clan. Cultivation sects were quite different, especially the larger sects. Not only did they occupy the best spirit veins, but they also had many high-grade cultivators. Whenever something happened, he wouldn't need to display his true cultivation, and there would be little interference with his cultivation. It was truly leisurely to take cover underneath a larger power. After he condensed a nascent soul, he would no longer have anything to fear. He reckoned that, when that time came, The upper echelon of any sect would try to entice him through any means possible if he were to reveal himself. After all, who would be so foolish as to make enemies with a nascent soul cultivator? With this in mind, Han Li began to recall the sacred spirit veins of Dreamcloud Mountain, which were renowned in the entirety of the heavenly South region. In the end, the three great cultivator sects that occupied the spirit veins became priority targets for Han Li. Since he wished to enter one of the sects, Han Li naturally needed to compare the three sects' characteristics and drawbacks. But before all of this occurred, Han Li had already paid a visit to a small market city and acquired information on the past 100 years in the heavenly South region. Before Han Li had parted ways with the two sworn sisters, he had shared a bit of information with them. As the two women were foreigners to this land, they particularly desired to become familiar with the circumstances and great powers of this land. The heavenly South region's power structure had greatly changed since Han Li had last been there. First of all, the 9 countries of the heavenly South had been divided between the Devil Tao, the Righteous Tao, the Heavenly Tao Alliance, and the 9 Nations Union. There were no longer individual powers controlling each of the states. Previously, Han Li was only aware of the Righteous Tao, Devilish Tao, and the 9 Nations Union. After Han Li had left for the scattered star seas, the superpower known as the Heavenly Tao Alliance was formed. It consisted of the cultivators of over 10 various-sized countries in order to stand in opposition against the Righteous and Devilish Tao. While it was larger than both the Devil and the Righteous Tao, it wouldn't be a match if the Righteous and Devil Tao were to band together. However, it was only by a tacit agreement that the two sides wouldn't interfere with one another while they expanded by annexing their neighboring countries. Even during this short moment of peace, they still considered themselves enemies the entire time. There was no possible way they could possibly form an alliance. Additionally, disputes had risen internally over the distribution of their newly found gains, and both sides had sunk into internal strife. Neither of them were interested in confronting the Heavenly Tao Alliance. As for the Heavenly Tao Alliance, they were only a loosely connected alliance to begin with. Having the Righteous and Devil Tao leave them alone was exactly what they had wanted. Also, it was likely they didn't have the courage to attack them in the first place. With this, the three superpowers came to an equilibrium. In fact, the reason as to why there was 100 years of peace had much to do with the 9 Nations Union. The 9 Nations Union had taken many of the cultivation sects and vagrant cultivators that were displaced by the Righteous and Devil Tao, including the 7 sects of Yue, and were greatly strengthened as a result. With this great increase in power, they had originally believed that they would be able to suppress the spell warriors of the Mulan Plains. However, they truly didn't expect that in their war with the Mulan tribes, that the formidable armies of 2 additional tribes would come to their aid in such a timely coincidence, multiplying the number of spell warriors. The battle between both sides intensified and led to several large battles, resulting in a massive amount of deaths on both sides. Even so, the 9 Nations Union found themselves at a disadvantage and even had some of their land seized. Helpless, the 9 Nations Union began to request assistance from the Devil Tao, Righteous Tao, and Heavenly Tao Alliance for assistance. They also threatened that if the 3 powers were unwilling to send men, they would bluntly withdraw and allow the Mulan spell warriors to enter their lands. When the 3 parties received this information, they all sent men to assist despite their unwillingness. They all knew that if the 9 Nations Union were to withdraw, then the ferocious Mulan spell warriors would bring them no small amount of trouble in the coming days. With the reinforcements, the 9 Nations Unions was able to score a decisive victory, leaving several thousands of cultivators dead. They were able to gain steady footing against the Mulan's attacks and were once again able to stand firm. From then on, the 9 Nations Union decided to shrewdly request the 3 superpowers to alternatively send them reinforcements in order to resist the Mulan's attacks. Otherwise, if the 3 superpowers chose to remain passive, then they would do so as well and allow the Mulan to freely wreak havoc in their territories. Thus, after long negotiations, the 4 superpowers eventually reached an agreement. With the 9 Nations Union as the leader and the other 3 parties as subordinates, they created a joint pact against the Mulan. As a result of this pact, the Righteous and Devil Tao had managed to remain at peace for over 100 years despite having completely annexed their massive domains. With the threat of the Mulan covetously looming over their shoulders, they didn't dare to rashly start another war. As for the state of Zai and its 2 neighboring countries, they both belonged to the Heavenly Tao Alliance. The Ancient Sword Sect, the Drifting Cloud Sect, and 100 Possibilities Pavilion were among the core sects of the Alliance. The Mulan tribes were introduced in Chapter 358. Of the three sects controlling the sacred spirit veins, the most optimal choice for Han Li wasn't the Drifting Cloud sect, but the 100 Possibilities sect that was well known for its tool refinement. In addition to his original goals of finding a cultivation area, the 100 Possibilities sect disciples were particularly adept at refining all sorts of magic tools. Rumor has it that the sect even possessed refinement methods for peak-grade magic treasures. These treasures caused Han Li's heart to stir. However, it was a pity that the sect recruited disciples in the same manner as the state of UA's 7 sects used to. They prioritized recruitment from cultivation clans and only rarely accepted outsiders as disciples. Furthermore, a union of the 5 most powerful cultivator clans within the sect had monopolized the sect's allocated section of the Dreamcloud Mountain spirit veins in the west. Both of these factors had caused Han Li to relinquish any thoughts of joining this sect with slight regret. As for the Ancient Sword sect, as its name implies, it is extremely adept at sword-controlling techniques. All of their magic tools and magic treasures were various types of differently sized swords. As for the sect protecting arts, the true absolute sword arts, it was incredibly incisive and was widely known throughout the country. The Ancient Sword sect didn't exclusively take in disciples from cultivator clans, it also took in young vagrant cultivators. However, the sect required one to be extremely suited to their sword arts. If one's aptitude didn't match the sect's cultivation techniques, they weren't taken in. This was why they had the fewest disciples of the 3 sects despite how often they were recruiting. On the other hand, by relying on their domineering attacks, the disciples of the Ancient Sword sect prevailed over opponents of similar cultivation, leading the sect to be the most powerful of the 3. As a matter of course, they held the main spirit vein of Dreamcloud Mountain. The final sect was the Drifting Cloud sect. Instead of being renowned for its weapon refinement like the 100 Possibilities sect, the Drifting Cloud sect was famed for its pill concoction. The legendary spirit tempering pill was something that only a few of the sect's elders were capable of concocting. So despite the sect's inferior strength in comparison to the other 2, it managed to acquire the east portion of the mountain spirit vein. Additionally, the Drifting Cloud sect recruited the most disciples and possessed the least demanding requirements. On a whole, the sect only had 2 conditions for accepting disciples. Primarily, it required that one possessed decent spiritual roots and a capacity to be nurtured. Lacking that, they were also more than willing to accept any disciples that had poor aptitudes so long as their cultivation had already reached a high enough layer. After all, the Drifting Cloud sect pursued a disorganized assortment of various disciplines outside of its renowned pill concoction technique. These fledgling disciplines required large quantities of low-level cultivators in order to progress. As for vagrant chi condensation cultivators with poor aptitudes, they clearly understood that they had no future prospects after joining the sect and would eternally be low-grade disciples. Regardless, they joined with thoughts similar to Han Li's. It was quite convenient to take shelter in the great power of the Drifting Cloud sect. It was for this reason that vagrant cultivators flocked to the sect in large numbers. With the lax acceptance policies and the enticement of the legendary spirit tempering pill, the sect seemed to be the optimal choice for Han Li to infiltrate. With some lingering uncertainty, Han Li made a few additional inquiries and learned that the sect would soon be taking in more disciples, immediately dispelling any of his reservations. Without revealing any of his plans, he immediately took off and parted with the 2 women after making a few preparations. As recruitment day drew near, many chi condensation cultivators began to gather on the road. When Han Li saw this from the top of his mountain, he calmly joined them. On his walk along the path, he unhurriedly walked for about 2 hours without reaching the end. This wasn't because the mountain was large, but because the stone roads were being affected by a few shallow illusion techniques. They probably wished to use this to grind down the number of cultivators that wished to enter the sect. Given the lax entrance conditions of the Drifting Cloud sect, they may as well cull the cultivators that were too impatient to walk along the path. The several cultivators that walked in front of Han Li had discovered something amiss and immediately gathered together and started whispering to each other. They seemed to have guessed what was going on and continued to walk forward without hesitation. The group of cultivators seemed to be acquaintances. Despite having been ignored, Han Li continued on his way without paying them any heed. After yet another hour walking along the stone path, they eventually reached some blue stairs. The The group of cultivators happily quickened their pace as they climbed up the stairs. Still indifferent, Han Li Kami climbed the steps and examined the scene at the top. There was a huge, pure white platform that was over 400 meters wide, and the only other structure present was a small, unremarkable pavilion on the other side. There were several tens of different groups of variously clothed cultivators around it, but no one dared to step inside the pavilion. As for Han Li and the group in front of him, they wordlessly joined groups already there and sat down among them. Han Li inwardly sneered at the scene in front of him. While Qi condensation vagrant cultivators were unable to see anything, Han Li was able to see through the illusion formation with his spiritual sense. The small stone pavilion before them was actually a huge white jade tower. A sign hung from the tower had 3 large golden words, "Illusory Cloud Hall." 3 people stood underneath the huge sign and were looking down at the unknowing Qi condensation cultivators below, talking amongst themselves as they gestured. They relied solely on the spell formation for concealment and made no other effort to hide themselves. Of the 3, 2 were early Foundation establishment cultivators, while 1 was a mid-Foundation establishment cultivator. It seemed the 3 of them were in charge of receiving the newcomers. Han Li wordlessly walked amongst the nearby crowd and sat down at the edge with his head down. Although he closed his eyes, his spiritual sense completely enveloped the 3 Foundation establishment cultivators, and he easily eavesdropped on their conversation. A pale-faced youth that appeared to be in his late 20s pointed down at the crowd and spoke with a tone of dissatisfaction. "Senior Marshal Brother Q. Although the deadline hasn't yet been reached, there aren't many vagrant cultivators that have caught our eye. Most of the cultivators here wouldn't even pass the qualifications, and are clearly only at the 7th layer of Qi condensation. Do they think that the Drifting Cloud sect takes everyone? There is nothing we can do. 3 years ago, our sect accepted a large batch of disciples because they were suitable. And because Senior Marshal Uncle Jin was short on manpower, there was an exception made to accept 2 8th-layer Qi condensation cultivators at the time. This produced a misconception that it is easier to enter our sect, which is why there are so many vagrant cultivators that have come to try their luck." The man called Senior Marshal Brother Q was a white-robed mid-Foundation establishment cultivator in his 40s with a stern, squarish face and bright eyes. A vigorous youth with a heroic air chuckled and added, "Of course, we aren't going to be so lenient this time around. After all, the recently accepted low-grade disciples have been on the shoddier side with regards to their spiritual roots in cultivation. It seems an elder took notice of this and has already warned the sect master. As such, we will follow the sect master's word to accept nothing but quality." The pale-faced youth glanced down at the vagrant cultivators and disdainfully said, "Accept nothing but quality. If that's the case, then it would be fine if we choose 10 disciples and have the rest of them leave." Senior Marshal Brother Q glanced at the pale-faced youth and calmly said, "Junior Marshal Brother Liu shouldn't underestimate these vagrant cultivators. There may truly be a few unfounded geniuses among them. Junior Marshal Brother Sun Hue was once a vagrant cultivator too, but he managed to reach Foundation establishment with a mere 5 years of hard work. Although he was given a suitable cultivation technique and a Foundation establishment pill for his quickly acquired merits, this can also be considered part of his aptitude." When the pale-faced youth heard him, he quickly thought of something and dryly coughed. He then quickly smiled as if he felt some fear towards Senior Marshal Brother Q and said, "Senior Marshal Brother is correct. I've spoken wrongly." Senior Marshal Brother Q was about to say more to the youth, but Han Li wasn't interested, so he recalled his spiritual sense and began to meditate. As of current, he had restrained his Qi to the point where other cultivators only perceived him to be a 10th-layer Qi condensation cultivator. He should have no trouble entering the sect. About half a day later, there were many more cultivators in the crowd that had climbed up the stone steps. By the time the sun set, there were nearly 100 Qi condensation cultivators sitting on the stage. A majority of the cultivators there were youths, but there was also a middle-aged man with a particularly profound cultivation. At that moment, an expanse of red light suddenly burst forth from the stone pavilion, and it disappeared to reveal a 100-meter-tall tower, along with the 3 silhouettes standing above. Senior Marshal Brother Q swept his gaze across the crowd with a stern expression and calmly said, "We welcome all of you fellow Taoists to our Drifting Cloud sect. My martial brothers and I will be in charge of evaluating you disciples. I hope you fellow Taoists will clearly listen to what I will say next. Don't miss it." Upon seeing the sudden changes of their surroundings and hearing Senior Marshal Brother Q's words, The cultivators on the platform were momentarily shocked and then hurriedly stood up, wearing respectful and attentive expressions. All of the cultivators there knew that if they were to enter the Great Drifting Cloud Sect, they absolutely couldn't afford to leave a bad impression with the three men standing on the tower. Senior Marshal Brother Q revealed a satisfied expression upon seeing the vagrant cultivators being so tactful. Senior Marshal Brother Q slowly said with a solemn expression, "You fellow Taoists should all know the criteria by which we accept disciples. That being the case, I won't go into detail. Let's have our fellow Taoists who possess tri-attribute, dual-attribute, or special spiritual roots walk forward." The crowd stirred at this, and after a short moment, only 4 people walked forward, 3 men and a woman. Senior Marshal Brother Q swept his gaze over those 4 and calmly said, "You 4 will follow Junior Marshal Brother Liu, who will be in charge of evaluating your cultivation aptitudes." At that moment, the pale-faced youth stepped forward and wordlessly waved his arm. A white streak of light then flew out from his sleeve and circled in the air before turning into a huge embroidered scarf that gently floated about a meter off the ground. The pale-faced youth appeared atop the scarf magic tool in a blur and expressionlessly said, "Climb on. I'll bring you 4 to another place and examine your aptitudes there. Those that are unsuitable will naturally be sent back." When the 4 heard this, they glanced at each other with slight hesitation before climbing onto the scarf. The pale-faced youth then clutched his hands in an incantation gesture and caused the scarf to glow with white light before it set off through the sky in a streak of white light. After sending off the pale-faced youth, Senior Marshal Brother Q glanced down at those who remained and continued. Those with cultivations at the 10th layer and higher step forward and follow Junior Marshal Brother U. So long as anyone doesn't have too much a problem with their identities, they will be able to enter the sect. As for you remaining fellow Taoists, if you wish to enter the sect, then you are required to pass a test before you will be taken in. If you fail, I can only ask you all to diligently cultivate for several more years and come back once you've improved." Once that was said, an uproar occurred amongst the crowd. Apart from a few peculiar individuals, a majority of them revealed a disappointed expression. It seemed the standards of this selection would be far more strict and caused a few cultivators hoping for a fluke to grow greatly dispirited. Although he did say they could participate in a test to still join the sect, everyone knew that they were words spoken out of politeness. After all, with the number of people present, there would be no way for the Drifting Cloud Sect to give all of them a chance. Needless to say, these tests would be extremely difficult to pass if one's cultivation was beneath the 10th layer. Only cultivators at the 9th layer of Qi condensation would have even the slightest chance of success. In the past, only a sparse few cultivators at the 9th layer were able to pass these tests. Although those people all had poor aptitudes, they were able to succeed through a show of exceptional perseverance. As a result, despite their lacking future prospects, the Drifting Cloud Sect would be willing to accept them as they would be able to contribute towards their various fledgling disciplines. Underneath the envious gazes of the rest of the crowd, Han Li and 6 other cultivators walked forward. Senior Marshal Brother Q swept his gaze across them and nodded his head. When the valiant youth surnamed Yu saw this, he released a flying magic tool without any delay. A huge bronze alms bowl appeared before them. Without needing any words from the youth, Han Li and the group of cultivators obediently climbed onto the magic tool. The copper alms bowl then flew off deep into the Dreamcloud Mountains in a streak of light. As for the remaining vagrant cultivators that didn't qualify, Han Li was completely ignorant as to whether any of them would enter the sect, nor did he care enough to find out. At that moment, he was absorbed in examining the 6 others that were enveloped in the alms bowl's yellow light alongside him. There were 4 men and 2 women. Apart from a refined yellow-clothed woman that appeared about 20 years old, the others all appeared to be in their 30s. There was even a 50-year-old cultivator. Although he possessed the deepest cultivation of the group at the 12th layer of the Qi condensation, Han Li could only shake his head and inwardly sigh. If they didn't have much luck, cultivators with poor aptitudes had to spend an immense amount of time cultivating if they wished to reach the 10th layer or higher, resulting in Han Li and the yellow-clothed woman to have the youngest appearances in the group. If it weren't for the mysterious bottle that Han Li had encountered, he feared he would have spent most of his life cultivating like the 12th layer cultivator, only to reach the 6th layer. Entering a large cultivation sect would have been out of the question. When Han Li began to ponder about the past, he entered a rare state of absent-mindedness. Soon after, he regained clarity of mind and looked at the others. While they didn't appear to be particularly notable, they had faces full of excitement. But when Han Li's gaze fell onto large, fully bearded man, he narrowed his eyes for a moment, but soon his expression returned to normal. This wasn't because of anything unusual about the man's appearance, but because there was a trace of indescribable cold yin qi in him. This yin qi was very well hidden, and if it weren't for Han Li's extraordinary spiritual sense, he would have completely missed it. This definitely wasn't a cultivation art that belonged to the five elements. From the fluctuations of his spiritual qi, he clearly possessed some unusual magic techniques. However, the large man's 10th layer cultivation wasn't even the slightest bit false, causing Han Li to ponder over it with great curiosity. As Han Li was lost in thought, a huge expanse of endless fog appeared before the huge alms bowl. This white fog was extremely dense and roiled as sounds of thunder faintly echoed out. Han Li's heart stirred and he sent out his spiritual sense. However, something blocked it when he attempted to reach about 30 meters into the mist. Han Li inwardly trembled, knowing that the white mist was an uncommon restriction. It was likely one of the drifting cloud sect's formidable sect protecting restrictions. He didn't dare to further rashly test it and hastily recalled his spiritual sense. The group of vagrant cultivators all revealed an expression of awe when they saw the endless mist. Although they'd never come across a spell formation before, the astonishing restriction before them had greatly broadened their perspectives. At that moment, the youth surnamed Yu formed a hand incantation and had his flying magic tool slowly come a stop. Then he grasped his storage pouch and took out an azure formation flag. After muttering something, the flag in his hand began to glow with a piercing radiance that gradually grew. Open. After the youth finished his incantation, he glared at the fog and pointed the formation flag at it. A bowl-thick azure beam of light shot out from the tip of the flag straight into the mist, leading to an astonishing scene. The other areas of the fog roiled as before, but the portion of the fog in front of them became extremely calm. Then, following a series of clear chimes, the white chi parted before them, revealing a 10-meter-wide passage. After this occurred, the youth surnamed Yu carried the group through the passage without delay. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared from sight. Not long after, the passage closed and waves of thunder sounded out once more. After the time it took to finish a cup of tea, the group eventually passed through the mist and emerged within a hidden land. Before they could even clearly see past the fog, they felt dense spiritual chi rush against them. Han Li couldn't help but take in a deep breath and feel a trace of joy well up inside him as he looked forward. There was a huge expanse of earth with verdant greenery, fragrant aromas, birdsong, and several mountains that spanned over 3 kilometers tall, reaching out as far as the eye could see. Surrounding these mountains were buildings of various sizes, including palace halls and pavilions of countless number, along with many variously clothed cultivators rushing about in a hurry. After seeing their surprise and excitement, the youth surnamed Yu silently smiled. He then pointed to the nearest mountain peak and said, "Take a good look. These are the 6 marvelous peaks of the Drifting Cloud Sect's monastery. If you truly enter our sect, this will be your home. But first, we will head to Dayspring Mountain's initiation residence. You'll explain a bit about your past, and then we will test your cultivation." Han Li and the other chi condensation cultivators weren't surprised by the information regarding the tests, and were brought to Dayspring Mountain by the valiant youth surnamed Yu. They met many cultivators along the way, with most of them being at chi condensation. When they saw their guide, they respectfully saluted him. It appeared the youth had quite the reputation in the Drifting Cloud Sect. They only came across one other Foundation establishment cultivator, a yellow-robed man with a thin face and sharp ears. He flew up from Dayspring Mountain, but when he caught sight of the youth surnamed Yu, he smiled and called out to him, "Junior Martial Brother Yu, are these 6 newly arrived disciples? It seems there were that many this time around." While he acted quite familiar with the youth, the others were able to see that he held hidden motives. The handsome youth unconsciously frowned upon seeing the yellow-robed cultivator. Regardless, he calmly replied, "So it turned out to be Senior Martial Brother Yan. These people still need to be examined with truth techniques and be introduced to the sect master before they become official disciples. They are still only candidates." The yellow-robed cultivator chuckled and said, "So it's like that. However, Junior Martial Brother should know that my Talisman Refinement Division still needs disciples. Do you think you could send 2 of these cultivators to me?" At that moment, his eyes focused on the group behind the young man. Han Li's expression was calm, but he felt quite disgusted from the gaze. From the way he looked at them and the tone he used, he certainly wanted to work them to the bone. When the other cultivators heard him, their expressions slightly changed. It seemed they also didn't have a favorable impression of him. Senior Marshal Brother Yan, that is not something I can decide. You should know that the allocation of disciples is decided by the sect master. If Senior Marshal Brother feels that he doesn't have enough disciples for his talisman refinement division, you may bring it up with the sect master. Since Senior Marshal Brother Miao is still waiting for me at the acceptance residence, I can't keep you company any longer. The youth surnamed Yu seemed to understand the yellow-robed cultivator's deceitful nature and immediately refused his request. After uttering an excuse, he stomped on his magic tool and brought the group of cultivators down to the pavilion below. The yellow-robed cultivator thought to further hold him back, but after hearing the youth mention Senior Marshal Brother Miao, he revealed slight hesitation and allowed him to go. After watching the youth and company enter the pavilion from a distance away, his expression fluctuated. After lowering his head in thought for a moment, he coldly snorted and flew off to a different mountain in a streak of yellow light. At that moment, the group had already arrived on the first floor of the pavilion and were meeting with an unfamiliar man. It was a shriveled youth glancing through a bamboo scroll with keen interest as he sat in a sandalwood armchair. The man only appeared to be 30 years of age, but his cultivation had already reached the late foundation establishment stage. Although he had only reached late foundation establishment and hadn't yet consolidated his cultivation, he truly was a rarely seen talent. Having reached so far at his current age, he had great hopes of rising to the core formation stage. Could it be because of this man's name that the annoying yellow-robed cultivator didn't dare to trouble Junior Marshal Brother Yu any further? When the other cultivators witnessed the shriveled youth's cultivation, they glanced at each other with expressions of shock. At that moment, this person had already folded up the bamboo scroll and glanced at the youth. He said with a soft voice, "Junior Marshal Brother Yu, I've put you through a bit of trouble. Did Junior Marshal Brother Yan block you just now?" Since Senior Marshal Brother already knows of it, there should be no need to ask. However, did that person come again to bother Senior Marshal Sister Paling? The valiant-looking youth asked with disgust. That person, even if Junior Marshal Brother Yan is somewhat excessive, he is still a fellow disciple of our Drifting Cloud sect. Your words are inappropriate. Please take note of it in the future, else if the master notices, punishment is unavoidable. The sickly youth's words may have been meant to rebuke him, but his tone was completely flat, lacking even the slightest anger. But all the same, the Junior Marshal Brother Yu's heart trembled and he hastily said, "Senior Marshal Brother is correct. This younger disciple will certainly pay attention to it in the future." Seeing that the youth admitted his error, Senior Marshal Brother Miao nodded his head and smiled. He then turned his gaze to Han Li and the others as he began to examine each of them. He seemed to be looking at them quite thoroughly, slowly examining them from head to toe. This had aroused quite a bit of anxiousness among those present. Possibly due to misconception, Han Li felt that his gaze momentarily paused on the large, fully bearded man before quickly turning to another person. Although it was impossible for Han Li's true cultivation to be seen through by him, Han Li felt slightly uneasy. After a short moment, Senior Marshal Brother Miao withdrew his gaze and calmly patted at his waist and took out a talisman that sparkled with silver light. "It's good that only about 7 have come as I had expected. Otherwise, I wouldn't have enough true heart talismans for all of you. Junior Marshal Brother Yu, take these talismans and place them on their body. After they take effect, bring them to my study." Senior Marshal Brother Miao spoke with a serene tone and handed the talismans to the youth. He then stood up from his chair and walked to the second floor without paying them any further attention. However, when the shriveled youth slowly turned the corner, he suddenly bent down and began to rapidly cough. It sounded quite painful, but soon after, he managed to stand up and head towards the stairway underneath the bewildered gazes of everyone there. A trace of astonishment flickered in Han Li's eyes, but it quickly disappeared. Junior Marshal Brother Yu revealed a trace of anxiousness and sighed before turning towards Han Li and the others. "These are true heart talismans. I'm sure you know what they do, so I'll save my breath. If you harbor any sinister designs or conspiracies, it would be best for you to take the initiative to leave. Otherwise, if you're discovered, don't blame our Drifting Cloud sect for being ruthless." With that said, a cold glint flickered from the youth's eyes as he glanced at the 7 before him. Although his tone was quite fearsome, nobody took the initiative to leave. As a result, the youth nodded with a relaxed expression and tossed the silver talismans towards the 7 with a wave of his arm. they all placed beneath each of their right shoulders. The youth then casually sat down without any regard for the other 7 and closed his eyes. The others glanced at each other in dismay. Although they all had their own thoughts in mind, none of them dared to tear off the truth talisman. They could only wait. At that moment, Han Li tilted his head and glanced at the silver talisman near his shoulder. For a very brief moment he smirked. Not long after, the talisman began to shine with silver light before it soon faded away. When the youth felt something happen, he opened his eyes and glanced at Han Li before emotionlessly saying, "Go to the second floor. Senior Marshal Brother Miao is waiting for you." When Han Li heard that, he glanced at the talisman and wordlessly climbed up the stairs. The second floor was quite empty with nothing apart from 2 prayer mats. The shriveled youth was sitting cross-legged on top one of them. When he saw that Han Li had arrived, he pointed to the other prayer mat and smiled. "Please sit down. There is no need to be nervous. It will be over quickly. The interrogation technique isn't anything like a soul bewitchment technique. It only determines whether or not your answers are truthful. Although it doesn't hold completely certainty, it will be correct most of the time. As such, I will ask you 10 questions. If 3 or more are judged to be false, you will not be accepted into the sect. Do you understand?" Han Li nodded his head and sincerely said, "Junior understands." He then sat down on the prayer mat in front of the youth. Regardless, Han Li inwardly sneered, as if the true heart technique could ever reveal his true intentions. "All right, let's start. Where were you born?" Seeing that the talisman on Han Li's shoulder was flashing with silver light, he began to ask questions. Han Li and the others flew off from the pavilion and headed straight towards the largest mountain. All of the cultivators had passed the shriveled youth's cultivation without problem. As such, once the Drifting Cloud sect master recognized them and had recorded their names, they would become official disciples of the sect. The main peak of the 6 marvelous peaks was also the largest, standing at over 10 kilometers. Many other mountains surrounded it like stars surrounding the moon, with Dayspring Mountain being among them. The top half of this mountain was also enveloped in a faint purple fog, concealing everything in a mysterious haze. Conversely, the bottom half of the mountain was bustling with activity. There were countless buildings of all sizes that covered the mountain, spanning from crude stone rooms to expansive 100-meter-tall palace halls, and there were a mess of countless scattered limestone roads throughout. Among these roads were stalls of all sorts with people selling and buying various goods. Many Drifting Cloud sect disciples were included among them as they haggled over the various items with the stall owners. When Han Li and the other cultivators saw this, they were left dumbstruck. The youth surnamed Yu was already accustomed to the sight and paid it no attention as he moved his flying magic tool forward. They shot about a kilometer into the air and flew into a stone hall. The stone hall was made of huge slabs of limestone that reached about 100 meters tall. Each side of the hall was connected to smaller side rooms that were only about 20 meters wide. There were very few cultivators that entered and left the halls. Cultivator Yu then landed the alms bowl in front of the hall and had all of them get off. Afterwards, he formed an incantation gesture and had the alms bowl quickly shrink before he put it away into his storage pouch. "Wait here for a moment, I have to report to the sect master first. I'll call for you afterwards." The youth then walked into the hall with large strides. The many chi condensation doorkeepers clearly recognized Cultivator Yu and merely saluted him with respect as they watched him walk into the hall. After the youth disappeared from sight, the guards curiously glanced at Han Li and the others. They seemed to have already guessed who they were. A while later, a streak of white light towards the palace hall before fading away. The light was revealed to be a huge embroidered scarf carrying the pale-faced youth surnamed Liu, along with the 4 other young cultivators that had left before them. The pale-faced youth gazed at Han Li's group of 7 and revealed a trace of surprise. But soon after, he landed his flying magic tool nearby and proudly entered the stone hall, leaving the 4 young cultivators behind. In the next moment, Han Li's group and the group of 4 young gifted cultivators glanced at one another. For some unknown reason, the atmosphere appeared somewhat amiss, despite the fact that both groups were going to enter the sect at the same time. There seemed to be a trace of hostility between them. But as they were about to enter the Drifting Cloud sect, the 2 sides could only keep silent and behave themselves. After the time it took to finish a meal, Cultivator Yu finally walked out from the hall. When he appeared, he immediately beckoned to Han Li's group and then turned towards the 4 gifted youths. "You 4 will be coming in with us. The sect master wishes to accept you all as disciples at the same time." With that said, the youth turned around and re-entered the hall. The two groups didn't dare to delay and hastily followed after him. Following the youth, they passed through a short corridor before entering a 100-meter-wide hall. There were 8 cultivators sitting in chairs, whispering about something as they each wore different expressions. After the disciples were brought inside, the seated cultivators immediately ceased talking and began to examine Han Li's group. At that moment, Han Li appeared sincere as he displayed deference to them. But at the same time, he had released his spiritual sense and inspected the appearances and cultivations of the seated cultivators. There was a late Foundation Establishment cultivator, 2 mid-Foundation Establishment cultivators, and the rest were only at early Foundation Establishment. Senior Martial Brother Q and the pale-faced cultivator were sitting amongst them. The blue-robed late Foundation Establishment cultivator waved his hand at the youth and smiled. "We've troubled Junior Martial Brother Yu. Please, take a seat." This person was the Drifting Cloud Sect Master, Wei Yiming. He had an ordinary appearance with 2 small eyes. However, each of his movements gave off an exceptionally imposing presence. It appeared he wasn't a simple character. "Many thanks, Senior Martial Brother." The youth cupped his hands and directly sat down in the chair at the side. At that moment, the seated cultivators finished examining Han Li's group and had finally moved on to the 4 talented youths. Each of the youths' gazes revealed a trace of fervent excitement, and their bodies straightened upon being examined. As Han Li took all of this in with a trace of surprise, he heard the sect master speak. After examining the new disciples, the sect master glanced at the other seated cultivators and slowly said, "Yes, these disciples are suitable enough to enter the sect. They are suitable. After all, we haven't taken in a batch of disciples since several years ago. Junior Martial Brothers, how do you wish for the disciples to be allocated?" "Actually, we wholeheartedly agree that the final decision will lie with Senior Marital Brother Wei." An old man with gray hair twirled his short beard and spoke with an exceptionally respectful tone. His voice then changed as he smoothly said, "My Hidden Sword Mountain has no need for any external affair disciples. However, for inner sect disciples, my own Hidden Sword Mountain only recruited 2 disciples the last time around and is lacking in manpower. My mountain should have a disciple this time around. I have no need for the other disciples, except for the disciple with the gold-forged constitution." After the old man said this, he pointed to the tall and sturdy youth. When the youth heard him, he couldn't help but reveal surprise. A deathly pale middle-aged man was unable to stay sitting upon hearing the old man, and bluntly retorted, "Humph, you might have received fewer disciples the last time around, but you also received a disciple with dual-attribute spiritual roots. Needless to say, our Fire Cloud Mountain must be the ones to claim the disciple with the abnormal constitution." When the gray-haired old man heard this, he chuckled and shook his head. "Your Fire Cloud Mountain mainly relies on fire attribute cultivation arts, but cultivators possessing the gold-forged constitution possess metal attribute spiritual roots. Junior Martial Brother Yang, your position is lacking. Even if your Hidden Sword Mountain possess metal attribute cultivation techniques, our Fire Cloud Mountain Senior Martial Uncle Li's metal tempering arts are renowned throughout the entire state of Zai. Why can't this disciple cultivate his techniques?" The middle-aged man didn't reveal the slightest intention of backing down. "You?" The sect master frowned and interrupted, "Enough, I've already heard your thoughts. There is no need to further speak of them." Senior Martial Brother Liu smiled and mediated. "That's right. Senior Martial Brother's dispute will have no end. It's better to have sect master decide. After all, regardless of which mountain receives him, he will still be a disciple of our Drifting Cloud Sect in the end. There is no reason to fight." The old man and the deathly pale middle-aged man glanced at each other, but the old man rushed to say, "Junior Martial Brother Q's words holds reason. Our Hidden Sword Mountain will hold no complaint if the sect master makes the decision." When the middle-aged man heard this, he hesitated for a moment before agreeing. The sect master's expression relaxed, and after a moment of thought, he turned to Han Li's group and calmly said, "These disciples are particularly special, so we should handle them last. Let's distribute these other disciples. After all, our 6 mountains of the Drifting Cloud Sect have never turned away good help. Let's first distribute these 7 external affair disciples." 2 hours later, Han Li and the fully bearded man stood on a huge alms bowl and were being brought back to Dayspring Mountain by Cultivator Yu. They'd already changed into the attire of blue robes for low-grade disciples and had been distributed to Dayspring Mountain. Cultivator Yu brought the 2 out of the stone hall once the distribution was finished, without the slightest complaint. As for the tall and sturdy youth that was in high demand, he was unexpectedly assigned to Illusion Stone Mountain. Although the gray-haired old man and the middle-aged man were both dispirited, they could only concede the matter. But fortunately, they were each given an inner sect disciple and ended up with something for their troubles. Although you've only entered the sect as external affair disciples, it is quite fortunate for you to be distributed to our Dayspring Mountain. Because of our martial ancestor gentle and kind-hearted, we won't treat you too harshly. You only have to finish your assignments within the given time. The rest of your time you will be free to do as you wish. If you have the opportunity to acquire great merits, perhaps the martial ancestor will even bestow a foundation establishment pill to you. After all, external affair and inner sect disciples receive the same treatment in name. However, the inner sect disciples' main assignments are to cultivate. Because of your poor aptitudes, you are assigned to other various tasks such as medicine and talisman refinement. The attainments of the many martial uncles in these fields are quite profound. Because Han Li and the fully bearded man were already disciples of Dayspring Mountain, Cultivator Yun spoke to the two with a much more gentle tone as he gave them an explanation of sect matters. Many thanks for martial Uncle Yu's guidance. Although Han Li found it somewhat awkward, he wore a respectful expression as he uttered his thanks. As for the fully bearded man, he merely grinned, appearing as if he weren't one for words. Already knowing that there was something amiss about his past, Han Li felt dumbfounded. The large man's acting skills had already reached perfection. Could it be he truly didn't know about the oddities of his own body? While that senior martial brother Miao also noticed something odd, Han Li was certain that a late foundation establishment cultivator wouldn't be able to see through the person's cold qi. There was certain to be something amiss. It was quite thought-provoking. Cultivator Yu seemed pleased by the two's reactions and spoke a few words more before bringing them to a pavilion located at the center of Dayspring Mountain. They landed on a limestone platform where two young teenagers were chatting about something. When they saw Cultivator Yu appear, they immediately stopped talking and approached them. The doll-faced girl chuckled and asked, "Well, if it isn't Martial Uncle Yu, did you come to visit Martial Ancestor?" Knowing the strictness of seniority in the cultivation world, Han Li felt shocked at the girl's casual attitude. Cultivator Yu smiled and said, "That's right. These two are external affair disciples that our mountain received from this selection. I'm here to report to Martial Ancestor and see which senior martial brothers to give them to." It appeared he was quite familiar with the girl. The girl then turned her gaze to Han Li and the large man. She sweetly smiled and said, "So they're newly arrived junior martial brothers. If you have an opportunity in the future, please don't forget to pay me and junior martial brother Xin a visit and tell me a bit about the mortal world. I'm looking forward to it." The dark-skinned teenager at her side meekly muttered, "If senior martial sister wishes to hear them, don't drag me in. I would prefer to cultivate." You can cultivate anytime you want, but having new disciples enter Dayspring Mountain from the mortal world is something that is hard to come by. Naturally, we should listen to a few interesting tales from the outside. Although she was quite young and dainty, she chided the boy with a bold attitude, leaving him at a loss for words. Cultivator Yu revealed a wry smile and shook his head before bringing Han Li and the large man into the courtyard. As they walked, Cultivator Yu warned, "Keep note of those two. Junior martial sister Ma and junior martial brother Xin may appear young and hold the same seniority as you, but they are the martial ancestors' descendants from the mortal world. Although they haven't yet been accepted as official disciples, it is a matter that will occur sooner or later. Do not offend them no matter what. Nobody will protect you from the martial ancestor." When Han Li heard this, he nodded his head with a forced smile. As for the large man, he rubbed the back of his head and silently smiled. When Cultivator Yu saw their reactions, he smiled and consoled them. Junior martial brother Xin is a sincere person. He won't do anything inappropriate. Although junior martial sister Ma has always been somewhat mischievous, she doesn't bear any malice. There is no need to be too worried about them. You just have to pay a bit more attention to them. Of course, Han Li and the large man repeatedly nodded their heads in response. After that was said, the three had already passed through 3 courtyards before appearing in front of a secluded side wing. As soon as the three appeared at the side wing, they faintly heard a man's voice. "Is that you, Junner?" When Yu Jun heard this, he immediately stopped in place and solemnly replied, "Disciple pays his respects to master. Your 3rd martial brother and your 5th martial sister also happen to be here. Go ahead and bring the 2 behind you inside." From the liveliness of the voice, the owner seemed to be in a good mood. Yes, Yu Jun didn't dare to delay, and called to Han Li and large man before hastily entering the half-closed door of the side room. Apart from several pots of various unknown plants, the elegant and refined hall only had a black wood table along with a set of chairs. A middle-aged man in scholar robes sat at the side. He had an incredibly old-fashioned appearance with a long, thin mustache and a beard that reached to his chest, giving him a sage-like appearance with otherworldly poise. To his side stood an old man and a young woman. With a wrinkle-filled face and pure white hair, the old man was by all means someone that appeared to have nearly reached his end. He was silently smiling. As for the woman, she appeared to be in her late 20s and possessed a fair, elegant appearance. She was currently expressionless. Yu Jun hastily stepped forward and saluted them in a kneel. "I pay my respects to Master. Greetings, 3rd Senior Marshal Brother, 5th Senior Marshal Sister. Please stand up. There are no outsiders here, no need to be so formal. So these two must be the newly accepted disciples of our Dayspring Mountain." The middle-aged man waved his arm and had Yu Jun stand up. Afterwards, he examined Han Li and the large man with interest. When Han Li saw that this person was a mid-core formation cultivator, he felt somewhat gloomy, but he could only force a smile and call out to him as martial ancestor. The large man had done the same. This martial ancestor possessed neither the capability of spotting the peculiarity of the large man's body, nor seeing through Han Li's true cultivation. As such, he asked for their names and casually said, "Good, good, good." He then turned to the old man and young woman at his side and mildly instructed them, "Since you two are here, I won't have to bother any others. As an expert in talisman refinement and a pill concoction adept, you should be lacking people. Take in these two newly arrived disciples for the time being. Naturally, pick a cultivation art for them along the way. Even if they are external affair disciples, if their cultivation is too poor, they'll be a target of ridicule by their fellow sect members from the other mountains." The white-faced old man replied with a wide smile, "Yes, Master. Junior Marshal Sister and I will take a person each." The beautiful woman in her 20s hesitated for a moment before nodding her head. After a moment of thought, the old man proposed, "Since Junior Marshal Sister also agrees, how about I take Marshal Nephew Du over to my Talisman Refinement Division? I am in need of sturdy helpers, so that will leave Marshal Nephew Han to you." The woman agreed with an unchanged expression, not bothering to glance at Han Li. When the middle-aged man saw this, he nodded his head and spoke to Han Li and the large man, "You two are dismissed. Wait outside for a moment. I still have matters to discuss with your seniors." Han Li and the large man glanced at each other before sincerely acknowledging him. They then headed out of the room and stood about 10 meters away from the room as they obediently waited. Soon after, the large man glanced to the cloudless faraway sky and remained still. It was unknown what he was thinking about. As for Han Li, he wore a lazy expression as he eavesdropped on the conversation inside. With his immense spiritual sense, Han Li was able to listen without a problem. Although his expression was unchanged, several odd movements escaped from his eyes. After the time it took to finish a meal, the door to the side room finally opened, and the three disciples left the room one after the other. The old man wordlessly raised his hand and released a slender magic tool. After he said his farewells to the woman and Yu Jun, he took to the skies with the large man in tow. At that moment, the woman walked over to Han Li and coldly swept her gaze over him. She emotionlessly said, "Let's go. You'll be coming back with me to my cave residence." A faint smirk momentarily appeared on Han Li's face before he nodded with an indifferent expression. With a pulse of red light, an expanse of red mist enveloped the both of them. 4 hours later, Han Li had appeared at a strange medicine garden that was over 300 meters wide. The verdant medicine garden had many types of medicinal herbs and a thatched cottage with 3 rooms. When Han Li saw the nameless small mountain nearby, he stroked his chin and revealed a faint smile. Previously, the cold and elegant mid-foundation establishment woman had used a red ribbon to bring the two to her cave residence. This martial ant, Mu Paling, had asked him if he was willing to look after the medicinal garden or if he was willing to learn the art of pill refinement. This had stunned Han Li. After all, so long as a cultivator was right of mind, they would agree to learn without a doubt. Before the woman waited for Han Li's reply, she coldly explained that looking after the medicine garden was rather simple. So long as he handed over a fixed amount of medicinal ingredients, he could spend a majority of his time in cultivation. Although external affair disciples also had an opportunity to touch upon the profound path of medicinal pills, The cost of pursuing that path was to refine a certain amount of pills every month, greatly reducing their cultivation time. As a result, each of them had their own advantages. Without even the slightest deliberation, Han Li instantly chose his old task of looking after the medicine garden. This was a task that may as well have been created for him. It would allow him to cultivate without fear or obstruction. He had originally thought that he would have to escape from various menial jobs in order to cultivate. But as it turned out, this extremely suitable medicine garden task was brought before him by fortunate chance. The cold, elegant woman didn't reveal the slightest surprise at Han Li's choice. Since he was brought here, Mu Paling brought away the original keeper of the medicinal garden and left behind a jade slip that recorded a water attribute cultivation art, the profound ice arts. This medicine garden had now become Han Li's domain. Han Li waited for the elegant woman to disappear into the sky before flipping his palm. There was now a blue jade slip, a green jade slip, and a yellow command talisman in his hand. The green jade slip included methods and tips on how to tend to the plants in the medicine garden that was left behind by the previous caretaker. Because the grade of the medicine herbs here was quite common, and there was only a small variety of them, so long as he wasn't a moron to the utmost degree, tending to the garden would be extremely easy. As for the blue jade talisman, it recorded the cultivation art that Mu Paling had left behind. The profound ice arts wasn't a top-grade cultivation art by any means. It was so pathetically weak that it couldn't even be considered a second-rate cultivation art. Its only merit was that it was easy to cultivate, and its bottlenecks were comparatively easy to break through. However, this wasn't a result of malice or bad intentions. As Han Li was an external affairs disciple, his cultivation must have been poor, so she had opted to give an easier cultivation art to him. As for the command medallion, it controlled the crude spell formation that enveloped the medicine garden. Of course, he didn't hold it with much regard and placed all three of the items in his storage pouch. Afterwards, he entered the thatched cottage with unhurried steps and slowly walked through it before leaving. As Han Li stood in front of the cottage, he swept his gaze towards the small mountain behind the medicine garden and revealed a faint smile. He slowly closed his eyes and gradually released his spiritual sense to envelope a radius of about 15 kilometers. After seeing that there were no other cultivators in the area, he waved his arms without regard. A series of clear rings sounded out as a dozen twinkling azure flying swords left his sleeve and shot towards the small mountain. Under the control of his spiritual sense, the flying swords efficiently cut out a cave from the mountain as if its stone were soft tofu. In an instant, he had already carved out a deep cave residence. Han Li's consciousness then split into many strands as he had them control each of his flying swords. Each of them began to hurriedly carve out stone rooms, each unique in their size and style. As Han Li had already become incredibly proficient in splitting his consciousness, this took very little effort. About 6 hours later, a new small-scale cave residence had secretly appeared in the mountain. Han Li revealed a trace of happiness at seeing that the first draft of his cave residence was completed, and immediately took out several sets of formation flags and discs. The small mountain then became incredibly busy, as several high-grade concealment spell formations were placed around it. Although this spell formation was incapable of escaping the keen notice of a nascent soul cultivator, it would escape the passing notice of a core formation cultivator. For Han Li, this would be enough for the time being. After all, there would be no reason for a high-grade cultivator to suddenly visit such a trifling medicine garden as this one. Also, these measures were only a temporary affair. Once he refined and placed down a spirit-constraining formation, even a nascent soul cultivator would be incapable of seeing anything amiss. After Han Li finished placing down the spell formations, he placed the ninth spirit ginseng inside his cave residence's small medicine garden. Only after carefully placing down several formidable restrictions around it did he release it from confinement. The ninth spirit ginseng was crucial if he was to condense a nascent soul. Following that, Han Li placed the gold-silver-gold devouring beetles into the insect room. As for the black-tainted gold devouring beetles, Han Li kept them at his side since he couldn't induce them to reproduce with the rainbow skirt grass. Neighboring the insect room was a spirit beast room he had specially prepared for the weeping soul beast. Because the beast had consumed such a large quantity of Umbra beast souls, it had remained in deep sleep ever since it returned to his storage pouch. Even Han Li was unable to wake it from its slumber. However, Han Li faintly guessed that because the weeping soul beast had consumed so many souls, it had begun to evolve a grade. Han Li naturally desired such an outcome. Having acquired a safe haven, Han Li immediately made peaceful arrangements for the beast. At that moment, Han Li also decided to take advantage of the beast's slumber to refine the Weeping Soul Pearl inside his stomach to completion. Because of the Weeping Soul Beast's soaring advancements, Han Li felt slightly worried that he would be unable to fully control the evolution of the Weeping Soul Beast. During his time in the Umbra realm, he felt the Weeping Soul Pearl stir several times in his stomach when the Weeping Soul Beast had savagely absorbed the Umbra Beast souls in his enlarged state. Although Han Li kept a calm face in front of Fairy Violet's spirit and Mei Ning, he had felt great trepidation. Now that he had the opportunity, there was no way he would dare to allow this situation to continue. As for Yuan Yao's explanation of the Weeping Soul Pearl's symptoms, they should pose little problem to Han Li given his superior magic power and spiritual sense. Moreover, the Weeping Soul Beast had unexpectedly ascended 2 ranks since then, and the symptoms may have been corrected. But regardless, in light of the Weeping Soul Beast's current abilities, it was worth braving the risk. With his plans decided, he didn't immediately refine the Weeping Soul Pearl, but instead chose to address another pressing matter, the wind spirit energy inside his body that had yet to scatter. Fengzai, the grade 9 windbreaker beast, naturally couldn't pursue him to the heavenly south region. However, the fact that the wind spirit energy still remained in his body was cause for much distress. Perhaps another incident would occur if too much time had passed, but directly refining this harmful energy didn't seem possible. He had tried several times before to little effect. As of current, he only had the clumsy method of using magic power to forcefully expel it. While it was possible, it would take no small amount of time. It was for this reason that Han Li had put it off until now. Now that he had settled down in a peaceful place, he planned on completely eliminating this danger inside his body. With several huge ape puppets acting as sentries in the medicine garden in order to respond to any sudden visits, he entered his refinement room. Han Li sat cross-legged in the quiet room with a solemn expression and immersed his spiritual sense into his body. He examined the lustrous golden light sphere that was contained inside his dantian and noticed that there was no change. After a moment of thought, he decided to control the divine Devilbane lightning that enveloped the harmful energy and had the net of lightning slowly relaxed to reveal a gap. The originally calm energy contained within the lightning immediately grew restless and wildly rushed out of the gap. Just as the strand of harmful energy began to rush out, Han Li's spiritual sense began to stir and had the golden lightning envelope it once more, closing the gap and restraining the remaining wind spirit energy. Not knowing what kind of chaotic harmful chi that the wind spirit energy contained, Han Li felt extremely worried that even this sliver could damage his meridians. Resisting his feelings of great unease, he circulated all the magic power in his body and began to forcefully expel the sliver of harmful energy. As he motionlessly sat inside the calm room, large beads of sweat began to flow down from his head, and his face paled. 4 hours had unknowingly passed. Han Li opened his eyes and spiritedly glanced around. He then waved his arms and flicked his fingers, shooting out 2 drops of gray liquid to the stone walls. 2 small holes appeared where they struck. Han Li let out a long breath of relief and wiped the cold sweat off his forehead. Although the expulsion process had been incredibly painful and strenuous, it still worked. If he continued this sliver-by-sliver process of expulsion, he reckoned that it would take half a year before his body was completely free of the wind spirit energy. This had greatly relieved much worry from his mind. After a moment of rest, Han Li calmly took out a black jade slip from his storage pouch and looked through the method of establishing the spirit-constraining formation. He had always been quite interested in this spell formation, but he never had the time to carefully examine it. He now took the opportunity to delve into it as he wouldn't feel truly safe until he had a spirit-constraining formation placed around his cave residence. In the following days, Han Li began to divide his time into several parts. Apart from the 4 hours he used to expel the wind spirit energy and a bit of time used to refine the Weeping Soul Pearl, he would spend the rest of his time studying the spirit-constraining formation. As for the outside medicine garden, Han Li had his many puppets tend to it. Additionally, Han Li continued to exploit the green liquid to mature the rainbow skirt grass and feed it to his gold-devouring beetles. He faintly felt that these beetles were about to reproduce once more. With this monotonous style of life, several months passed in the blink of an eye. During this time, Mu Paling visited him 2 times. Once she saw that Han Li had tended to the medicinal garden in accordance to her conditions, she didn't pay any more attention to the garden. As for the profound ice arts, the woman had no interest in taking the initiative to explain anything, as Han Li hadn't raised any questions. Mei Paling had continuously treated Han Li with a neutral indifference during her visits, as he preferred. It would be best for him to have this woman forget that this medicinal garden even existed. If she stopped paying him any visits, it would be very convenient for his cultivation. After yet another month passed, Han Li had finally grasped a near-complete understanding of the spirit-constraining formation, and immediately placed one down around the mountain in accordance to his understanding. As a result, the faint spiritual chi fluctuations of the spell formations had completely vanished. From the outside, the small mountain appeared completely ordinary, much to Han Li's satisfaction. In the next 3 months, Han Li had both fully refined the Weeping Soul Pearl to completion and expelled the wind spirit energy in its entirety, far quicker than he had originally expected. But what surprised Han Li the most was how he didn't feel any illness or headaches upon connecting his spiritual sense to the Weeping Soul Pearl when he completely refined it. It seemed that the Weeping Soul Beast's unexpected evolution had also caused the deathly Weeping Soul Pearl to also undergo a strange transformation. Han Li was overjoyed by the discovery. As for the harmful wind spirit energy, although it had been difficult and exhausting to expel it from his body, once he had expelled a majority of it, it had become far easier to deal with. Not only was the harmful energy less painful to handle, but he was able to expel it from his body in much less time. The last several strands of energy had been extremely easy to rid himself of. After carefully examining his body several times to find no abnormalities, Han Li eventually felt relief. With the most vital matters already taken care of, Han Li focused his attention to cultivation, and the medicine pill refined from the ninth spirit ginseng. He pondered for several days on the matter of cultivation, before deciding to simultaneously cultivate the 4th layer of the Great Development Technique and the Azure Essence Sword Arts. According to his previous experiences with forming a golden core, a powerful spiritual sense seemed to greatly benefit in breaking through bottlenecks. Even if the 4th layer of the Great Development Technique was extremely difficult, Han Li planned on giving it a try. Even if spiritual sense didn't provide a particularly large benefit in condensing a nascent soul, it would at least prove greatly beneficial when confronting an enemy. While this path may somewhat increase the time it would take to reach the false nascent stage, Han Li didn't believe the choice was incorrect, as he would only lose a bit of time at the worst. As for the matter of refining the ninth spirit ginseng, Han Li couldn't afford to be negligent. While the other materials were easily replaced, the ninth spirit ginseng, the grade 8 demon echo grass and the agate horn were nowhere to be found in the heavenly south. If he were to fail in the pill refinement process, Han Li would be left without any alternative. As a result, Han Li began to study the formula for the ninth spirit ginseng in between his cultivation. He often refined a few various pills in accordance to the techniques described in the formula in order to improve his own pill concoction techniques. Time began to slowly pass by as he repeatedly cultivated and refined pills. During this period, Han Li had also taken the time to learn demon script in preparations to comprehend the old hide book and the copper plate in his possession so that he could finally learn what they contained. By making use of his eidetic memory, Han Li was able to easily grasp the ancient demon characters and began to look through the details of the hide book. The old hide book contained a demon art known as the 9 Gale transformations. After taking a look at it, Han Li discovered that the technique was specialized for bird-type demonic beasts. It contained a series of spell arts, body techniques, and 2 secret techniques. The spell arts and body techniques were out of the question. Unless a powerful demon were to cultivate it, one would find their body bursting halfway as they cultivated it. As for the 2 secret techniques, one of them was the nameless concealment technique that he had been using this entire time, the hidden wind technique. However, the nameless concealment technique was slightly altered from the original in order to become more suitable for human cultivators. It currently held no value to Han Li apart for reference. However, the other secret technique that was described was of much interest to Han Li, the blood shadow evasion technique. As the name implies, blood shadow evasion was a strange movement technique that draws support from one's blood essence and allowed one to flee over 50 kilometers in an instant. Secret techniques that drew support from one's blood essence in order to display great abilities were something that most Devil Dao cultivators were capable of. However, This bloodshadow evasion was quite different from the secret techniques of humans. First of all, one is incapable of controlling the distance traveled with this technique. When this technique was activated, one would instantly turn into a crimson blur as they shot over 50 kilometers away. Secondly, this secret technique required a large, fixed amount of blood essence. Once the technique was activated, the blood essence for this technique would immediately ignite. However, if one lacked enough blood essence to use the technique would cause one's body to rupture halfway through and turn into a cloud of gore. It was a truly dangerous technique. Lastly, activating this technique required a pair of wings. Because bloodshadow evasion was too fast, without any wings to maintain balance and a particular body lightning technique, the technique could cause one to crash into the earth after traveling only a short distance or return back to where one started. In brief, a clean escape would be an impossibility without them. Han Li carefully read through the secret technique several times. No matter how he saw it, he felt that it was very suitable for him to cultivate. While other humans might not have wings, Han Li had the thunderstorm wings. The treasure's spirit wings were no different from true wings. If the bloodshadow evasion was truly as amazing as described, then it was an optimal technique for escaping. After all, the thunderstorm wings could only use lightning evasion to travel over a small area. It would only be able to flicker incessantly and would be incapable of making a clean escape. After committing the cultivation method of bloodshadow evasion to his memory, he started to look through the copper plate. The copper plate didn't have a name for its techniques, and its descriptions made little sense. Han Li also found the strange cultivation postures unfathomable. After glancing at the techniques it recorded, Han Li was left particularly confused. After all of this, Han Li faintly recalled what the Flood Dragon had said. This divine provenance plate seemed to be damaged beyond use. It was no wonder why he couldn't make sense of the plate. After realizing this, Han Li grew greatly dispirited and could only put the plate away. From that day on, Han Li added the bloodshadow evasion to his cultivation routine in addition to the Great Development Technique and the Azure Essence Sword arts. Although he later felt that he had grasped the technique, he didn't dare to rashly test it. A great decrease in blood essence wasn't something that could be joked about. This continued as half a year unknowingly passed. One day, Han Li sat inside a quiet room as he cultivated the Great Development Technique when he suddenly opened his eyes. A strange expression flickered over his face as his body immediately glowed with azure light before he immediately shot out from his cave residence to the medicinal garden. A short moment later, Han Li was standing in front of the medicine garden's cottage with all of his puppets placed away. He glanced to the southeast and pensively thought for a moment before taking a seat inside the cottage. He then steeped a cup of tea and assumed a relaxed position. A short moment later, an extremely polite voice came from outside the medicine garden's restrictions. "Excuse me, could you tell me if Senior Marshal Sister Yuan is here? I am the Hidden Sword Mountain's Kui Huan." The young man's voice seemed to contain a trace of urgency. Senior Marshal Sister Yuan. Was that the name of the original caretaker of the medicine garden? Han Li's face remained calm as the new arrival shouted several more times. Han Li then downed his cup and slowly replied, "Senior Marshal brother, there is no need to shout. Senior Marshal Yuan left this place half a year ago. This medicine garden is now being cared for by me. If you wish to find her, then you should pay a visit to Marshal Aunt Mew's cave residence." What? The medicine garden changed caretakers? The young man was astonished. From his tone, it seemed he wasn't trying to find someone, but had come to the medicine garden for something else. The man chuckled and amiably said, "Since Senior Marshal Sister Yuan isn't here, then Junior Marshal Brother will do. Would Junior Marshal Brother release the restrictions so that I may have a chat with you?" Han Li rubbed his chin. From how elegantly spoken his words were, Han Li had no grounds to refuse him. After some thought, Han Li walked out from the cottage and took out a yellow command talisman. With a flash of radiance, the mist surrounding the medicine garden began to slowly dissipate. This revealed a yellow-robed young man that stood in the southeast of the restriction. The man had thin eyes, thick eyebrows, and a large, straight nose. His head was also slightly smaller than normal. Although his appearance couldn't be said to be ugly, it was somewhat comical. His cultivation was only at the 9th layer of chi condensation, somewhat inferior to Han Li's displayed cultivation. It was unknown how this person was able to enter the drifting cloud sect.